Hello, fellow sapiens. Whether you're here to fall asleep or just let your mind unwind while driving, cooking, showering, or working quietly in the background, you're in the right place. This is Sleepless Homo, where we tell the story of humanity, slowly, calmly, fact by fact. So take a deep breath. Let the noise of the world fade just a little. You don't need to take notes. You don't need to agree. You just need to be here. And maybe ask the same quiet questions our ancestors once did. If you find these slow, documentary-style journeys helpful, if they help you learn something new or drift gently into thought, consider liking and subscribing. That small click helps more curious minds discover this soft science space, a space for long-form, evidence-based storytelling, built not on wild speculation, but on humble science. Science that doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but keeps asking the right questions. And if you feel like it, leave a comment to tell us how you use this kind of content. Are you listening before bed, while commuting, or even just scrolling late at night from the other side of the planet? Also, if you happen to drift off at some point, no worries. There are timestamps in the description below, so the next day you can pick up right where you left the story. Because this one, start to finish, is worth hearing all the way through. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, let's begin. Today's episode is a slow, deep journey into the greatest turning point in human history. A question that still echoes in every field, every city, every human stomach. Was farming our greatest invention or our most irreversible mistake? Let's go back, over 20,000 years, to the world before the first seed ever fell from a human hand. For tens of thousands of years, long before the first seed was planted or the first wall was raised, our ancestors moved through a world that was not theirs, but one they understood. A world that offered no guarantees, but plenty of options. They crossed savannas, followed herds into river valleys, carved paths through thick forests, and waited out winters in caves lit by the crackle of fire. Every season was a conversation. Every meal, a question of timing, place, and knowledge. There were no farms, no fences, no towns, no property lines, and no word for wild, because there was no concept of being separate from the land in the first place. This was the baseline of human life. For most of our species' story, this was normal. And so we ask humbly, why change everything when everything worked? By 50,000 years ago, our species, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, had already spread across most of Africa, into the Levant, and deep into Asia. Some had reached the cold steppes of Central Eurasia. Others had pushed into the tropics of Southeast Asia. A few may have even made the treacherous crossings toward the Sahul landmass, the ancient supercontinent that once connected Australia and New Guinea. These were not small migrations. They were population waves that rewrote the human map, following prey, avoiding predators, and exploring coastlines with a confidence that still confounds archaeologists. But they weren't chasing conquest. They were chasing survival, with skills that had been honed for hundreds of thousands of years. This world was mobile, it was flexible, it demanded memory, intuition, teamwork, and deep, inherited knowledge. In this era before farming, food was not stored in barns or buried in silos. It was stored in the landscape itself, in the knowledge of ripening seasons, animal tracks, bird calls, fish tides, and migration routes. You didn't grow food, you located it. You didn't protect a plot of land, you protected relationships, between kin, between generations, and between groups who might compete or collaborate depending on the weather. We tend to imagine hunter-gatherers as roaming aimlessly, but in reality, their movements were precise and patterned. They had annual rounds, circuits of land they visited each year to harvest resources at just the right moment. Hazelnuts in the autumn, shellfish on low tides, herds crossing river plains in spring. This mobility was not random wandering, it was seasonal choreography, passed down through stories, landmarks, and the knowledge etched into memory. And they did not move alone. These humans shared the planet with other kinds of humans, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in the East, and perhaps others we have not yet named. But even within Homo sapiens, there was staggering diversity. Each group adapted to their ecosystem in different ways. Some used bone harpoons to fish African lakes. Others built shelters on the mammoth steppe using tusks and hides. Some groups specialized in reindeer hunting, while others foraged for roots and tubers in forest clearings. Their diets were varied and often more nutritious than ours today. And this wasn't because they were healthier in some modern sense. It was because the ecology demanded it. A forager's diet was a daily puzzle with thousands of pieces. Animal protein might be abundant in some seasons and nearly absent in others. Plants could be toxic without preparation. Nuts had to be cracked and stored. Shellfish carried parasites. Mushrooms? A risk few would take without deep training. This meant that survival depended not on brute strength, but on cognition, on cooperation, on watching and remembering. Grandmothers were as valuable as hunters, and children were trained from infancy to observe, mimic, and memorize. A misplaced step, a misjudged plant, a forgotten migration path, any of these could mean the difference between feast and famine. But here is where the story becomes interesting. Despite the danger and unpredictability, hunter-gatherer societies were often marked by what anthropologists now call immediate return economies. That is, you worked for what you needed today. There was little long-term storage and little accumulation of goods. You shared because tomorrow you might be the one in need. It wasn't utopia, but it fostered social norms based on reciprocity. And that made inequality very difficult to sustain. There is no perfect society, of course. Violence happened, jealousy happened, territory was defended, and strangers were feared. But the structure of life, mobile, interdependent, flexible, did not reward hoarding or hierarchy in the way later societies would. Leadership was often situational and temporary. Prestige came from generosity, not accumulation. And when tensions flared, the ultimate tool for conflict resolution was simple: you walked away. In a world without fences, exile was always an option. This lifestyle, which may feel alien to us now, was the dominant human mode for over 95% of our existence. And there's no evidence they wanted to change it. On the contrary, the archaeological record shows that for thousands of years, even when new resources became available, like wild grains or semi-sedentary fishing spots, most groups continued to choose mobility over settlement. It wasn't that they didn't know how to settle, it was that they didn't have to. But time was slowly shifting the rules. Around 30,000 years ago, we begin to see signs of increasing resource intensification in some areas. Foragers were spending more time in fewer places. In places like the Levant, Japan, and parts of Africa, seasonal camps began to lengthen. Large shell middens and clustered hearths suggest some groups were returning to the same spots year after year, even staying put for whole seasons. But these were still hunter-gatherers, just ones experimenting with stability. The choice to settle, when it came, was not because someone invented farming. It was because the landscape was changing, and their response to those changes would, eventually, change the course of history. Yet this moment had not yet come. In the period between 50,000 and 20,000 years ago, humans were still walking, still hunting, still gathering, still following the rhythm of the land rather than trying to rewrite it. They shaped the world with fire, with trails, with memory. But they did not try to dominate it, not yet. From southern Africa to the snowy valleys of Europe, from the Siberian steppe to the Indian coastline, Homo sapiens lived in small bands, rarely more than a few dozen people. Children were raised by the group. Tools were made from stone, bone, sinew, and sometimes ivory. Music and art already existed. Flutes made from bird bones, ochre-painted cave walls, carved figurines held in hands we'll never know. They lived in a world with no written records but no shortage of stories. They sang. They remembered. They adapted. They had no word for prehistory. They were living it. And now comes the question. If this life, mobile, diverse, richly embedded in place, was so functional, so deeply human, then what pushed us to give it up? Why did some of us stop moving, start planting, and begin the long, irreversible process that led to cities, kings, borders, and us? The answer is not simple. There was no switch flipped, no single moment of awakening. It began quietly, in small shifts, in rivers running lower, in herds moving elsewhere, in new plants growing where they hadn't before. Climate did not cause farming, but it bent the rules of what was sustainable, and humans, being humans, adapted again, but this time in a direction they could never walk back from. And that is where we go next, because the world was about to warm, the ice would retreat, and a small group of humans in the hills of the eastern Mediterranean would begin to stay, just a little longer, in one place. But for now, we hold the image. A world before agriculture, a species still wild but not lost, a rhythm of life that worked for tens of thousands of years, and a question that still haunts us. Were we better off before we began to settle? At the height of the last great ice age, much of the northern hemisphere was locked in a silence made of ice, wind, and waiting. Glaciers stretched across Europe and North America, dragging mountains with them and grinding entire valleys flat. Even far from the ice sheets, the cold shaped every breath of life. Forests thinned into tundra, rivers froze, animals moved south, and so did people. And for thousands of years, this frozen world held steady, a planet wrapped in caution tape. It was a long pause, a stilled heartbeat, but it would not last. Somewhere around 24,000 years ago, the Earth began to turn, not all at once, not loudly, but enough to shift the background rhythm of life. The sun's energy, wobbling on its long orbital cycle, slowly tipped the balance. The glaciers did not melt, not yet, but the winds changed. Dust patterns shifted, sea levels paused their drop, and ecosystems, always listening, began to whisper back. For the humans living through this cold maximum, none of it was obvious. There were no meteorologists, no carbon dioxide charts, no satellite imagery. There were only the signals that mattered, where the animals went, how the plants behaved, when the rains fell, how deep the snow settled. And the signals, in certain regions, began to change, not dramatically, but just enough to cause friction. Across the Levant, Anatolia, and the Iranian plateau, foragers who had long relied on diverse food webs, gazelles, wild cattle, migratory birds, edible seeds, began to feel those webs tighten. Not all at once, and not everywhere, but with just enough pressure that daily life became less predictable. Some animals became harder to track. Seasonal patterns blurred. Dry periods stretched longer than expected. It was not yet a crisis, but it was a question. How long could the old ways hold? What followed was not a straight line toward innovation, but a landscape of slow tension. Between 24,000 and 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum reached its coldest and driest phase. This was not just an ice problem, it was an ecological problem. Cold temperatures compressed habitats, fragmented ecosystems, and triggered what scientists call trophic collapse, a breakdown in the food chain, starting at the top. As megafauna declined or migrated, the predators and scavengers that depended on them either followed or vanished. And humans, somewhere in the middle of these chains, had to adapt. Some moved. Others diversified their diets. A few clung to shrinking refuges where the land still offered enough to make it work. In Europe, this meant hunkering down in river valleys and coastal plains that remained ice-free. In the Levant, this meant squeezing into narrow ecological niches, patches of forest, riparian zones, steppe corridors, wherever something still grew. In places like Anatolia, the compression was particularly intense. The plateaus and mountains had long acted as corridors between biomes, but now they became bottlenecks. Groups that had once spread wide across landscapes were now pushed together into more confined zones. And with that came another kind of pressure, human-to-human competition. We should be clear, this was not the end of abundance, but it was the end of casual certainty. A world that had once allowed wide roaming and broad diets was now punctuated by thresholds. The threshold of how far you could walk in a day without seeing game. The threshold of how much water could be stored in bone-dry seasons. The threshold of how often you could return to a familiar site before others had claimed it first. For the first time in a long time, limits were becoming more visible than options. And still, the planet turned. After nearly 4,000 years of deep freeze, the glacial grip began to loosen, again, slowly. By around 19,000 years ago, retreating ice in parts of Europe exposed new corridors, while in the Near East, small changes in rainfall began to stir dormant ecosystems. Grasslands crept higher into the hills. Wild grains, long part of the forager's toolkit but never a staple, began to flourish in pockets where the rains lingered longer. This was not yet agriculture. It wasn't even proto-farming, but it was a new abundance, short-lived, localized, and tightly linked to climate. Here is where the story complicates. As the ice retreated and the ecosystems began to rebound, not everyone was ready to relax. In fact, the opposite often happened. The post-glacial world was marked not by smooth recovery, but by climate whiplash. The warming trend was jagged, interrupted by sudden reversals. One of the most dramatic came in the form of the oldest dryas, a cold snap between around 16,000 and 14,000 years ago. In Europe and the Near East, plant communities that had just begun to re-establish were abruptly cut back. Foragers who had adjusted to the early warmth now had to readapt to chillier conditions. This kind of instability has been called the push-pull of late glacial foraging. The land would offer new opportunities and then revoke them. Game would return to old routes and then vanish again. Rain would return to dried valleys, then stop. In this uncertainty, some forager groups began to develop more complex strategies for resource prediction and risk buffering. This did not mean planting, but it did mean noticing patterns, revisiting specific patches of land at more regular intervals, and perhaps even beginning to manage those landscapes in subtle ways, by burning, clearing, or selectively harvesting. The line between foraging and management is not bright, it is smeared with experimentation. And experimentation may have been the only consistent strategy. In places like the Levant and Zagros, for example, we see evidence of groups becoming more regionally specialized during this time. Some clustered around lakes or wetlands, exploiting fish and reeds. Others focused on hunting smaller game in upland zones. In some valleys, wild pulses and nuts became more common in archaeological layers, suggesting a shift toward gathering strategies that leaned on more plant-based calories. But again, this was not yet cultivation. It was a response to climate opportunity, or sometimes climate betrayal. If there is a thread running through these 10,000 years, it is not invention, but improvisation. No single behavior dominates the record. Some groups thrived with very little change. Others collapsed or vanished from the archaeological trail. Human success in this period was not based on innovation alone, but on the ability to shift, scatter, and regroup when conditions changed. And conditions changed often. What did this feel like from the inside? Of course, we don't know. No journals, no letters, no oral histories survived this long, but we can guess, carefully. A young person born into this world would have grown up hearing about how things used to be, how the herd once passed this way, how the rains used to fall at this time, how the marsh used to be deeper. And they would have noticed early that such stories were no longer reliable, that the land was changing in ways their elders couldn't predict, that the old timing was off. For some, this may have sparked a quiet urgency, to watch more closely, to return to the same grove more often, to mark the bloom of the acacia tree, to count the days between a migration and its echo, not because they were planting, but because they were paying attention. And attention, more than technology, was the seed of what came next. By around 14,000 years ago, the world had entered what scientists call the Bulling Alarud interstadial, a period of rapid warming that would, temporarily, create a climate more favorable to plants, animals, and humans. But with this warming came new questions. More plants, more animals, more rainfall, but also more humans and more competition. Landscapes that had once been avoided for their barrenness were now attractive again. River valleys refilled, grasslands rebounded, forests crept north, and with them came opportunity, pressure, and, eventually, the first steps toward a way of life that had never existed before. We are not there yet. No farming, no permanent houses, no herds. But we are close, because something else is changing, quietly and invisibly. The relationship between people and place is beginning to shift, and with it, so is the story of how humans belong to the land. But that shift would take a name, a specific culture, in a specific corner of the ancient Near East, and that is where our next story begins. For now, we linger in this moment, at the threshold of transformation. The land is not what it was. The old rules are still in place, but they tremble. And somewhere in the minds of a few clever foragers, a dangerous thought is forming. What if the land will not provide again, unless we make it? And so we ask again, when the land stopped providing, what did we invent instead? Let's follow that question. It is easy to imagine our ancestors as eternal hunters, lean and mobile, following the hooves of wild gazelles across dusty plains. It is harder, and perhaps more important, to remember that long before anyone ever tilled a field or fenced a herd, there were gatherers who were not just foraging passively, but transforming landscapes with knowledge, hands, and stone. The story of food does not begin with agriculture, it begins with flour. Somewhere near the shores of a freshwater lake in what is now northern Israel, around 23,000 years ago, a small group of humans built shelters. The wood came from trees that no longer grow there. The hearths were carefully placed, their edges lined with flat stones. Nearby, in the shallows of the lake, reeds bent in the wind, and fish darted through the clear water. Today, this site is known as Ohalo II, and it gives us one of the oldest, clearest glimpses into the quiet revolution that was already underway before anyone called it farming. Among the remains were tens of thousands of charred plant remains, including over 100 species of edible seeds, fruits, and nuts. This alone was unexpected. Most archaeological sites preserve only a few clues to what people ate, often focused on animal bones or a handful of charred grains. But at Ohalo II, thanks to waterlogging and fire, the spectrum of human diet opened like a botanical catalog. Cereal seeds were present, but they were just one part of a broader strategy, one that included wild barley, wild wheat, acorns, legumes, and a wide array of small-seeded grasses. To work with these foods required tools, and here too, Ohalo II delivers. Flat grinding stones, still embedded with starch residues, suggest that flour was already on the menu, not occasionally, regularly. These were not backup foods scraped together in hard times. They were routine, perhaps even central, and that changes everything. Because to eat seeds is not the same as gathering them. Small, wild grains take effort. They must be collected, cleaned, ground, and often cooked to become digestible. You do not stumble upon a field of barley and eat it raw. You labor for it. And to do so at scale, as Ohalo II suggests, requires not just time but a specific kind of knowledge. When each plant ripens, how to strip it without killing the stalk, which species grow together, which ones vanish if you overharvest, and which come back stronger. This kind of knowledge accumulates. It passes through generations like fire through dry grass, and over time it allows people to become what archaeologists now call intensifiers. Not farmers, not yet, but humans who pushed harder on their environment, extracted more from less, and learned to work the edges of stability without tipping into collapse. The term super-gatherer may sound modern, even comic, but it fits. These were people who could recognize the season by the color of a seed's husk, who stored baskets of parched grain under riverbank ledges, who understood that fish and nuts and acorns each had their moon. In the Levant and across the Zagros foothills, dozens of Epipaleolithic sites from this era now tell similar stories. They are less complete than Ohalo II, but the pattern is clear. Grinding stones appear in greater numbers. Storage pits begin to show up. Some sites reveal heavy investment in nut processing, including burnt shells and cracked stones designed to split hard casings. Others show localized specializations, fish traps, snail middens, or intensive berry collection. Each one a thread in the larger story of pre-agricultural ingenuity. And here is the quiet irony. These intensifiers were likely more flexible than their descendants would be. They used more species, not fewer. They ranged farther, not less. Their diets were not built around a single grain or a single strategy, but around options. Wild plants in the spring, fish in the dry season, meat when it could be found, nuts when they were ripe. It was a world of rhythms, not rules. This flexibility also left a light footprint. Most of these groups did not build permanent dwellings. They returned to familiar places, perhaps annually or seasonally, but they rarely stayed long enough to deplete them fully. Their tools were portable, their shelters temporary. Their environmental impact, while noticeable in subtle signs like fire-scarred hillsides or trampled reed beds, was minimal compared to what would come later. Still, something was shifting. The use of grinding stones alone speaks volumes. These are not tools you carry casually across great distances. They are heavy, cumbersome, and often reused over years. To maintain them implies either returning to the same place or living nearby for longer stretches. In some sites, their presence may hint at the earliest inklings of semi-permanent camps, not villages, but stops along a circuit where certain resources could be reliably processed. and processing, more than harvesting, was the true labor. Grinding is slow. It takes time, coordination, and sometimes multiple people. The result, flour, is a marvel. Storable, cookable, combinable with water, fire, and other ingredients. Once humans mastered this process, even at a small scale, they changed the equation. They could carry calories in compact form. They could stretch lean seasons. They could plan. With planning comes imagination. It is difficult to know whether the people at Ohalo II or their cousins in the Zagros imagined controlling the plants they harvested. There is no evidence that they did, but there is something equally important. They knew how to return. They knew where the best patches were. They may have cleared away competing vegetation. They may have broadcast leftover seeds. They may have burned sections of brush to encourage regrowth. None of this is cultivation, but it is the management of possibilities. It is also, in its own way, beautiful. A form of relationship that was neither domination nor dependence. These gatherers did not reshape the land to serve them. They listened, learned, adjusted, and occasionally nudged. They were, in a sense, ecosystem collaborators, not owners, not yet. And perhaps this is the question that sits at the heart of this era. Why didn't they go further? If they had the tools, the knowledge, and the seasonal return patterns, why did they not leap into full-scale farming? The answer is likely that they did not need to. Intensification filled the gap between scarcity and security. The variety of plant species meant resilience. If one failed, another often did better. The mobility of their camps meant they could follow opportunity. And the absence of population pressure meant there was no urgency to extract more than what the landscape could recover from. In many ways, this system may have been more sustainable than what followed. It required more ecological literacy, not less. It allowed for a higher degree of dietary diversity, and it fostered a kind of human-animal-plant relationship that was dynamic, responsive, and, above all, humble. The story of these super-gatherers is not a prelude. It is a peak in its own right, a culmination of hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary knowledge expressed not in monuments or armies, but in baskets of seeds, stone tools with calluses worn in the same spot, footprints leading to and from a hearth that held more than warmth. And yet, time moves. Landscapes change. People notice patterns. And somewhere, over these thousands of years, a new idea quietly stirred. What if, instead of returning to the wild grain patch, we encouraged it to grow here, near the hearth? What if, instead of walking to the nut grove, we tended a few saplings nearby? What if, instead of remembering when each species was in season, we altered the season to suit ourselves? What if flower came first, and the field only followed? That thought, still only a flicker in the minds of these master-gatherers, would someday bloom into everything we call agriculture. But in this moment, between 23,000 and 16,000 years ago, the world belonged to those who knew how to listen, those who could turn a landscape into a menu, those who ground the seeds of the future without yet knowing what they were planting. And so we ask, when did harvesting become owning, and what do we lose when every meal starts in a single field? Why build a house if you're not staying to farm? In most of the world's story, houses and harvests arrive together. The plow cuts the land, and soon after, walls rise around hearths. It seems obvious to us, the way farming and permanence fit together. But in the southern Levant, during a narrow window of time between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago, a very different kind of human settlement appeared. These were not farmers. And yet they built homes, buried their dead in clusters, returned again and again to the same slopes and springs, and intensified their hold on the local landscape without ever sowing a field. Their name, given to them by modern archaeologists, is the Natufians, but their logic, still strange, still unsolved, still worthy of wonder. The first puzzle is their choice to stay. All across the Levant, particularly in the hills stretching from today's northern Israel into parts of western Jordan and Syria, sites appear with unexpected density and complexity. The houses are not made of mud brick. That comes later. But they are real structures, sunk partially into the earth, lined with stone foundations, and often reused across generations. Some had paved floors, others clustered together in groups, suggesting communal decisions about layout and space. The word village might be too strong. But the impression is clear. This was not a stop on the way. This was home, at least for a season, and sometimes for longer. At a site called Ain Malaha, near the Hula Valley, stone huts curve into the soil like shells. Their walls, made from uncut fieldstones, range from 3 to 8 meters across. Inside, the hearth sits central, blackened with the remains of hundreds of fires. Scattered around are bone tools, flint blades, groundstone mortars, and sometimes personal ornaments, pendants carved from bone or tooth, pierced shells, beads of stone that must have been brought from kilometers away. The debris of daily life. But life here was not merely utilitarian. It was remembered. The cemeteries tell us so. At several Natufian sites, burials occur in consistent places. People were interred beneath house floors or in shallow pits nearby, sometimes singly, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in tight clusters that suggest family or lineage. There are signs of careful treatment, bodies placed in flexed positions, stones arranged above or around the graves, and in a few cases, red ochre staining the bones. Grave goods are rare, but not absent. A pendant here, a dog buried beside a human there, enough to suggest that even before writing, even before the gods of wheat and rain, people were beginning to hold memory in place. But what does it mean to settle down without cultivation? The Natufians remain one of the most fascinating contradictions in human prehistory. They were sedentary, or at least semi-sedentary, but they were not yet farmers. And yet, they acted like people who expected to return. They built homes. They cached tools. They buried their ancestors in the earth and likely told stories about who rested where. Their foraging strategies intensified, especially around nuts, wild cereals, and small game. But the key is that nothing in their toolkit shows they were manipulating the genetics of plants. Not yet. Not in this window. Instead, they focused on management, abundance, and probably prediction. In the oak woodlands and grasslands of the southern Levant, wild barley, wild wheat, and a host of legumes and nuts could be harvested seasonally in sufficient quantities to support longer stays. The presence of large mortars and grinding stones, many fixed in place, tells us that processing took place on site. These weren't tools for the road, they were tools for the home, and home was something new. The diet wasn't just vegetal. Animal bones recovered from sites like El Wad Terrace show a marked shift in hunting strategy compared to earlier periods. Large game like gazelle and deer are still present, but there's a rise in smaller animals, hares, birds, even turtles. These are not prestige kills. They are calorie-dense, plentiful, and localized. They suggest a shift from high-mobility tracking to landscape-wide harvesting. In short, if it moved and could be eaten, it was on the menu. One theory is that population pressures drove this intensification, but that's difficult to prove. What is clearer is that something in the social structure changed. Longer stays created new problems and new opportunities. Waste had to be managed. Resources had to be monitored more carefully. Disputes over land, water, or memory may have begun to rise. And rituals, whatever form they took, likely gained power in reinforcing group cohesion. The dog appears around this time as well. Not yet in every village, not yet in every grave. But the famous burial at Ain Malaha, where a person was laid to rest with their hand resting on a puppy's flank, tells us that a new relationship was forming, one between two species who began choosing each other in ways neither fully understood. Domestication is too strong a word for this period, but the partnership, the invitation to stay close, was already underway. Still, the Natufian world was not one of continuous abundance. Climate oscillations, especially the rapid onset of the Younger Dryas after around 13,000 years ago, would bring sudden cold snaps and unpredictable rainfall. For groups that had learned to rely on the richness of specific patches, these shifts may have been destabilizing. The archaeological record shows some sites being abandoned, others reduced in scale. Some scholars suggest this period marked the end of the Natufian way of life as it had existed. Others argue that adaptation, not collapse, followed. What's clear is that the experiment of semi-sedentary foraging had pushed the boundaries of what was possible without cultivation. But that returns us to the central question: why build a house if you're not staying to farm? Perhaps because staying means something different when your relationship with the land is based on familiarity, not control. Perhaps these people did not see themselves as innovators, but as stewards. returning each year to the same nut grove, the same barley patch, the same spring where turtles sunned themselves and birds nested in the reeds. In that rhythm, the hearth becomes an anchor, not a monument to dominance, but a promise to return. The Natufians, in this light, were neither primitive nor proto-farmers. They were something else, a culture balanced delicately between mobility and memory, between harvesting and home. Their legacy is not in what they planted, but in what they dared to settle without planting. They remind us that sedentism does not require agriculture, it requires confidence, in the land, in each other, in the cycle of seasons returning once more. And that might be the most radical part of their story, because in a world still shaped by cold winds and shifting rains, they chose to stay. They chose to bury their dead near their hearths. They chose, for reasons still not fully understood, to believe in place before they believed in plowing. So we are left wondering, was staying the first revolution, not farming? And what does it mean even now to belong to a land that hasn't been made to obey you? Did we domesticate wheat, or did wheat domesticate us? To answer that, we need to step back from modern agriculture with its machines, chemicals, and tidy rows, and sit instead with a human, crouched in a field 11,000 years ago. In the cool hours just after dawn, they move slowly through a patch of wild einkorn. This grass doesn't know it is destined to change the world. Its stalks sway, brittle and lean, topped with tight bundles of seeds that shatter with the touch of a hand. That shattering is the plant's genius. It scatters its children on the wind, a perfect adaptation for survival in the wild. But it's also inconvenient for a human who wants to carry those seeds home. So this human does what is easiest. They pluck the stalks that don't fall apart. They gather what stays whole. And unknowingly, they begin to rewrite the genome of wheat. For generations, maybe even thousands of years, people in the Levant and the northern reaches of Mesopotamia harvested wild cereals, not in straight lines, not under plows, but in patches of abundance that could be visited again and again. They used flint sickles, grinding stones, baskets woven from reed or grass. Their hands knew the season, the rhythm of ripening, the scatter of seeds. And over time, through this repetition, the landscape began to shift. The core cereals in this quiet transformation were three: einkorn wheat, emmer wheat, and barley, all wild, all local to the hills and valleys of the Fertile Crescent. They were not farmed, not yet, but they were harvested with such frequency and consistency that certain traits began to dominate: slightly larger seeds, stalks that held together longer, grains that ripened at the same time rather than scattered unpredictably. These were not deliberate improvements. They were side effects of human preference, unspoken selection pressures applied gently over time. Take the trait known as non-shattering. In wild grasses, the seed head fractures easily, helping the plant spread. But for people trying to gather it, this was frustrating. The stalks that held their seed until the moment of collection were favored, consciously or not. By gathering those over and over, generation after generation, people slowly skewed the wild gene pool toward plants that did not behave like wild plants at all. These new grasses began to rely on humans to propagate them. They dropped their defenses. They gave up their independence. And in doing so, they changed us. Because once a human group began to rely on these less wild plants, their freedom shifted too. You couldn't just walk away from a patch of proto-domesticated barley and expect it to thrive. You had to return at the right time. You had to ensure no other group stripped it bare. You had to monitor, protect, and eventually intervene. Domestication is a two-way leash. The seed changes shape, but so does the society around it. We have the archaeological traces of this slow entanglement. At sites like Tel Abu Huraira in the Euphrates Valley and in layers of the northern Jordan Valley, seed remains tell a quiet story of change. Grains from 13,000 years ago show a majority of wild traits: small seeds, brittle rachis, uneven ripening. But by 10,500 years ago, that begins to change. A measurable percentage of seeds show larger size and tougher husks, signs of incipient domestication. And yet, even now, no one is digging rows or irrigating fields. These are still foragers. But they are foragers living with plants that no longer act like wild grasses. The pace of this change is slower than many once assumed. Earlier theories imagined a rapid agricultural revolution, perhaps a few centuries of dramatic innovation. But the evidence paints a different picture. The transition from full wild type to majority domesticated traits in cereals took at least 2,000 to 3,000 years. Some recent genetic models suggest it could have taken longer. This is not the story of a sudden breakthrough. It's the story of an accidental agreement between plant and primate. You help me stay intact, I'll help you spread. Einkorn, the earliest wheat to begin this transformation, grew best in the rocky hills of southeastern Turkey and northern Syria. Emmer, more robust, favored slightly wetter soils and would eventually become the foundation of early Egyptian and Mesopotamian agriculture. Barley, hardier than both, tolerated a broader range of climates and would spread widely across Eurasia. But in this early period, they were still local foods, used by communities who lived seasonally, moved strategically, and understood their environments with exquisite detail. One of the more haunting aspects of this story is that no one involved would have thought of themselves as farmers. These were not people making a conscious shift to a new lifestyle. They were simply doing what worked, gathering what they needed, returning to the best spots, favoring the easiest harvests. The idea that this was the beginning of a new epoch would have been laughable, and yet, in hindsight, this was the hinge. Because once seeds begin to rely on humans, and humans begin to rely on those specific seeds, the door opens to deeper changes: division of labor, ownership of land, predictability of yield, the rise of surplus. But in this window, between 13,000 and 10,500 years ago, all of that was still latent. The seed was changing, and so were we. But neither party fully knew what it was signing up for. It's tempting to ask if there was a moment, a clear boundary, when wheat became domestic. But nature rarely gives us clear lines. Even today, many modern crops retain wild-type traits, and some wild varieties show mutations we associate with domestication. The truth is fuzzier. It's about statistical drift, not bright revolutions. We don't know who gathered the first mutant barley. We don't know if they noticed it, or celebrated it, or shrugged and moved on. What we do know is that these small acts, repeated and quiet, nudged entire ecosystems in a new direction. There's a strange humility in this. The agricultural transformation, as world-altering as it would become, did not begin with a blueprint. It began with a convenience, and that convenience bound us to grasses that grew taller, clung tighter, and surrendered to the hand. We didn't invent farming in a flash of genius. We slipped into it, one handful at a time. And maybe that's why the question remains so open-ended. Did we domesticate wheat, or did wheat domesticate us? The deeper we look, the harder it is to separate the actor from the acted upon. The seed changes, but so does the society. The grain thickens, and so do the ties to place. We begin to settle, not because we choose to, but because the food that feeds us asks it of us. There is no moral here, just a quiet truth. Sometimes the things we think we control are the ones shaping us the most. What happens when the weather stops changing? For most of the time that humans have been human, the climate has been moody, restless, and erratic. A slow freeze one century, a sudden melt the next. Storms that wiped out entire coastlines, droughts that emptied lakes, glaciers that surged down into green valleys. The late Pleistocene was a time of massive instability, and our species learned to ride those waves. Mobility was survival, adaptation was the rule, and the world never sat still long enough to let us settle down, until it did. Around 11,600 years ago, something shifted. The world calmed. The transition was not announced with thunder, but it was monumental. This moment marks the beginning of what we now call the Holocene, the most stable climatic period in the last several million years. After tens of thousands of years of wild fluctuations, temperatures evened out. Glacial pulses gave way to long, warm intervals. Rainfall patterns stabilized. The atmosphere's carbon levels rose gradually and then plateaued. It was, in a word, boring, and that boringness changed everything. The effects were not immediate. Human societies did not wake up one morning, check the dew point, and decide to plant villages. But over time, this newfound stability began to shape possibility. For the first time in remembered generations, the rhythm of the seasons became predictable. Floods came when expected. Frosts retreated further up the hills. The chaotic oscillations of the Pleistocene gave way to the gentle undulations of the Holocene, and the ecological consequences were enormous. In the Fertile Crescent, where the jagged mountains of the Zagros meet the soft river plains of Mesopotamia, this shift was especially powerful. Here, the native flora included grasses like einkorn and emmer wheat, barley, and lentils. These species had been gathered for thousands of years already, but they thrived under the new conditions. Rainfall increased in key zones and fell more regularly. The growing season lengthened. Soils enriched by millennia of glacial loess and seasonal flooding became more responsive. Suddenly, seeds that were dropped, either intentionally or accidentally, had a much higher chance of germinating and surviving. In this sense, the Holocene did not merely allow cultivation, it rewarded it. The risks associated with returning to the same patch of land year after year diminished. The rewards of tending or minimally managing plant stands increased. Slowly, imperceptibly, human behavior adjusted to match this new climate regime. Not because someone invented farming in a laboratory of ideas, but because the weather kept its promises. Globally, the pattern repeated itself with local variation. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, rainfall bands shifted northward, greening regions that had been arid. In the highlands of Papua and New Guinea, root crops like taro began to thrive in new ecological niches. In China, the lower Yangtze warmed into a region suitable for wet rice. These transformations were not simultaneous or coordinated, but they share a common cause. The Holocene stabilized the rules of the ecological game. For the first time, local knowledge became reliably transferable across generations. There is a term for this kind of climate stability: interglacial equilibrium. It's a temporary lull in the longer pulse of Earth's ice age cycles. We are, technically, still inside that lull. And it's hard to overstate how foundational this window has been for everything that came after. Every ancient civilization, every city, every scientific breakthrough, every modern state, they all emerged during this quiet window of relative planetary calm. It is the backdrop against which the entire human experiment unfolded. But back in the early days of the Holocene, none of that existed yet. There were only small bands of people, with memories of harsher winters and emptier landscapes, beginning to notice that their surroundings no longer changed the way they used to. Rivers flowed longer into the dry season. Certain groves of wild trees now fruited reliably. The grass patches returned each spring with more uniformity. And where a mother had harvested barley one year, her daughter might do the same the next, and so might her granddaughter. These were not yet fields, but they were becoming places. The psychological implications of this change are difficult to measure, but important to imagine. In a world where nature was once erratic and often hostile, humans had lived with a sense of permanent readiness to move. Now, that need began to fade. And with it, so too did certain social patterns. A predictable climate fosters predictable returns. Predictable returns favor long-term investments. And long-term investments mean staying put, at least some of the time. This was not uniform, and certainly not utopian. Many groups remained mobile, seasonal, or hybrid in their lifeways. The idea that climate stability forced humans into farming is far too simplistic, but it did lay the groundwork for what came next. Without this planetary calm, the feedback loop between cultivation, surplus, and population could not have locked into place. From the standpoint of geology, the Holocene is young, barely a blink. But for human societies, it is the cradle of everything familiar. Art, architecture, metallurgy, writing, law, and capitalism all arose under Holocene skies. And all of them, in some small way, owe their possibility to that quiet shift around 11,600 years ago. Of course, climate is never entirely still. Even the Holocene has its wobbles. The Younger Dryas, just before this period, had been a final cold snap that jolted ecosystems into chaos one last time. But now, the cold retreated for good. Glaciers melted back into alpine basins. Sea levels rose, slowly, yes, but unstoppably. Vegetation belts shifted northward. Lakes formed, sometimes over centuries, sometimes in sudden pulses. Forests reclaimed tundra, and the animals followed. For humans, this meant new calculations. Reindeer and wild aurochs migrated to different ranges. Small game became more plentiful in some areas, less in others. Fish runs stabilized. Wetland ecologies expanded. What had once been risky to rely on became dependable, and dependability in turn bred new patterns of trust, not just in the land, but in each other. You could plan a harvest or a return trip or a gathering. You could stockpile. You could even eventually build. But building requires more than just materials. It requires belief. Belief that tomorrow will be similar to today, that your efforts will not be swept away by a storm or starved out by a drought. The Holocene, by accident or grace, gave that belief a foundation. For the first time, humans could count on the sky, and that trust rewired everything. Still, there is a deeper question humming beneath this story. If climate stability encouraged us to stay, to plant, to harvest, to build, what happens when that stability ends? Because the Holocene, for all its calm, is not permanent. The Earth's orbit shifts, the tilt of its axis wobbles, and now, through our own doing, the carbon we have added may pull us out of this gentle phase. If agriculture was born in a rare moment of planetary stillness, what does its future look like in a world returning to chaos? But that's a question for later. For now, we return to those early Holocene hills and valleys, to the places where rain returned and lingered, to the hands that began to notice the seasons settling into place. They could not have known they were standing at the edge of something vast. All they knew was that the sky had softened, the grasses were stronger, and for once, the land was predictable. And so, they stayed. What if agriculture wasn't a choice but a slow trap? It's tempting to imagine a eureka moment. A bright-eyed forager squats beside a barley patch and declares, "Let's plant this one." The tribe cheers. Civilization begins. But science rarely rewards those kinds of stories. Instead, what we see in the evidence left behind is a far more tangled thing. A slow dance between people and plants. Centuries of tinkering, reversals, failures, experiments without names. In the highlands of the Zagros and the volcanic basins of central Anatolia, farming did not begin as a revolution. It began as an indecision. And in many places, it stayed that way for a very long time. By around 10,500 years ago, small communities across the Near East had already begun using plants and animals in complex ways. They gathered wild cereals and pulses in regular patterns. They hunted ibex, wild sheep, and pigs seasonally. But crucially, most groups did not rely entirely on any single strategy. Instead, the archaeological record shows a patchwork. There were places with signs of early cultivation, burned grains, morphologically altered seeds, nestled right next to camps that still relied on seasonal foraging and broad-spectrum hunting. This was not a clean break. It was a muddy threshold, a blurry world in which people were experimenting with what staying put might offer, while still hedging their bets with the wild. In the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, this pattern becomes especially vivid. At sites like Ganj Dareh and Asyab, layers of habitation reveal long-term contact with wild goats and cultivated barley, but not in a way that suggests a total shift. Instead, the remains show mixed diets, diverse food waste, and continuing reliance on foraged roots and hunted deer. Tools adapted to both grinding grain and processing meat lie side by side. Bones from infant goats suggest early culling, a sign of herd management, but not yet true domestication. It looks like a people halfway down a path, not quite ready to commit. And maybe, if they could have seen the future, they wouldn't have. The same is true in central Anatolia, where communities in the Konya Plain built settlements like Çayönü and Bonkuklu. Here, the houses appear semi-permanent, with mud brick floors and internal hearths. But there are no grand fields, no monocultures, and no signs of animal stabling. Instead, plant remains show an eclectic diet of wild barley, legumes, and fruits, alongside wild game, freshwater fish, and seasonal birds. The toolkit, too, is ambivalent. Sickles and grinding stones, yes, but also projectile points, scrapers, and composite tools more at home in a hunting economy. If these people were farmers, they were part-time, hesitant ones. And they had reason to be. Early cultivation was not particularly efficient. Without domesticated traits like non-shattering ears or uniform ripening, wild cereals were difficult to harvest and store. Replanting meant sacrificing valuable grain. The labor required was massive. Soil had to be cleared, weeds removed, and yields defended against animals. And the payoff was delayed. A good hunt fed you that day. A planted field made you wait months. In lean years, it might fail altogether. What emerges from this period is not a story of sudden innovation, but one of cautious adaptation. The people of these highlands and valleys were testing the edge of an idea. They were not farmers. They were ecological tinkerers, reshaping small parts of their landscape, sometimes intentionally, often incidentally, and never with a clear plan. Agriculture, if we can even call it that yet, was not a destination. It was a condition that crept in when no one was watching. One of the most telling signs of this in-between state is the persistence of mobility. Even in communities with semi-permanent dwellings and food processing equipment, we see indications that people still moved. Some groups likely cycled between seasonal camps. Others practiced vertical transhumance, moving up and down elevations to follow food availability. Certain buildings were reused over generations, but not necessarily year-round. Storage pits were shallow and temporary. Faunal remains suggest seasonal slaughter rather than continuous herding. In short, the commitment to place was partial. And this raises a difficult question. If farming really was such a breakthrough, why didn't it spread faster? The answer again lies in the ambiguity of the archaeological record. There was no one path. In many regions, the earliest farming experiments stalled out or reverted. Climatic shifts, disease, or soil exhaustion may have played a role, but so did human judgment. It is very likely that many early communities tried something like agriculture and then walked away from it. This is not a failure, it is intelligence. Evolution favors adaptability, not progress. And these were adaptive people. They watched the rhythms of their land, they noticed what worked and what didn't, and they adjusted. In some places, planting wild barley year after year may have seemed worth the trouble. In others, the returns were too low. A rich oak forest or a steady gazelle migration might offer a more reliable living. Farming did not spread because it was brilliant. It spread because it was persistent, and because eventually it became hard to escape. As populations grew, slowly at first, the need for predictable food intensified. Groups who had once moved freely found their ranges overlapping. Game grew scarce. Travel became risky. The logic of cultivation, once just one option among many, began to look more attractive, or at least more necessary. And yet even then, the transition was not clean. The world of 10,000 years ago was full of hybrids. People who grew some food, hunted for the rest, moved occasionally, and experimented constantly. If there is a single image to hold on to here, it is not a plowed field, it is a footpath between two worlds. And perhaps this is why the myth of the agricultural revolution has been so persistent, because revolutions are tidy. They come with beginnings, heroes, and measurable change. But farming did not arrive in a chariot. It emerged out of confusion, frustration, climate shifts, and accidents. It wasn't invented, it accreted. The bones of this story are subtle. Changes in seed coat thickness, increases in juvenile animal remains, shifts in tool use ratios, microscopic wear patterns on flint, carbon isotope ratios in soil. This is not a drama told in bold lines. It is a murmur at the edges of habit, a slow recalibration of life in places where the weather had finally, mercifully, become predictable, but never generous. And maybe that's the haunting part. Agriculture was not born out of abundance. It was born out of limits. It was a survival strategy that calcified into a way of life. And once it took root deeply enough, it began to shape human bodies, societies, and eventually the entire biosphere. But in these early days, in the shadow of the Zagros, and across the dusty plains of Anatolia, people still had a choice. Many made it, many didn't. Today, when we speak of farming, we often do so as if it were destiny, a triumph. But what if it wasn't? What if it was the slow closing of a door, a narrowing of options that once felt like freedom? This period, 10,000 to 9,000 years before today, holds that tension. A time when people still remembered the wild and still walked it, even as they began, ever so cautiously, to shape the tame. The trap wasn't sprung yet, but the bait was out, and it looked, from a distance, like a promise. When did we stop chasing animals? and start owning them. There was no ceremony, no treaty signed between species, no single moment when a hunter laid down their spear and called a goat a friend. Instead, what we find in the archaeological record is quieter and messier, a slow redefinition of the relationship between humans and animals, one that began not in fields or pens, but in middens, latrines, ash piles, and broken habits. The story of animal domestication, at least in its earliest chapters, is not about control. It is about proximity, and about which creatures could tolerate us long enough to become something else. Between 10,000 and 8,500 years ago, in the highlands of the Zagros and the foothills of eastern Anatolia, the first clear signs of sustained human-animal entanglement begin to appear. The species that stars in this strange transition is Capra aegagrus, the wild bezoar goat. Agile, wary, and well-adapted to rugged cliffs, it was not an obvious candidate for domestication, but it was abundant, and more importantly, it was social. Herd-bound, hierarchical, and capable of following a leader. Traits that, in the right conditions, could be nudged. The conditions, it turns out, were garbage. At sites like Çatalhöyük, an early settlement near the Melendez River in central Anatolia, archaeologists have uncovered layers of compacted trash that stretch back more than 10,000 years. Charred bone fragments, ash, broken tools, coprolites, and food waste form thick deposits just beyond the edges of domestic structures. In these piles, warm, smelly, and constantly restocked, wild animals began to gather. Dogs, yes, but also rodents, birds, and ungulates like goats, whose presence may have started opportunistically but ended in something far more permanent. The garbage heaps were magnets. They offered food, warmth, and a low-effort survival strategy for bold or desperate animals. Over time, those who lingered longer, who tolerated human noise, who didn't bolt at the scent of fire or sweat, they stayed. And generation by generation, the selective filter of proximity began to operate, not through deliberate breeding at first, but through exposure. Animals that could thrive near us began to cluster around us, and those animals changed. At Ganj Dareh in western Iran, researchers found goat bones displaying the first evidence of selective culling. Instead of equal age distributions seen in hunting contexts, the remains skew toward young males. Adult females were kept longer. This is a pattern associated with herd management, retaining milk-bearing does and removing surplus males. It reflects a shift in perspective, from prey to product. And yet the goats themselves were still wild, genetically and morphologically. What was changing wasn't their biology, but our behavior. It's a process sometimes called proto-domestication, a gray zone in which animals are not quite tame but no longer entirely wild. They may roam during the day, feed independently, even breed without human intervention, but they return, follow, linger. The relationship is reciprocal, but uneven. The goats benefit from access to safety and food scraps. The humans benefit from predictability. And slowly, as generations pass, this uneasy alliance begins to solidify. There is no single trigger. Instead, the shift appears to be cumulative. People began to corral goats near their homes, possibly using fences or natural barriers. They may have intervened in breeding, selecting calmer individuals, separating aggressive ones, timing births to coincide with seasonal food cycles. Bone growth patterns from this period suggest that goats under human management were smaller, possibly undernourished in winter, but shielded from predators. Their horns began to curve differently. Their social structures shifted to accommodate human oversight. At Çatalhöyük, a detailed analysis of dung layers reveals goat droppings accumulating in specific spaces, suggesting penned animals. These are among the earliest examples of permanent animal housing, and yet no monumental architecture surrounds them. No inscriptions mark the moment. The pens were humble, the fires were smoky, and the animals likely still remembered what it meant to bolt. This was domestication without drama. One of the more revealing patterns comes from looking at the broader community. People did not immediately stop hunting. Alongside goat bones, archaeologists find remains of deer, wild boar, and gazelle. The transition was not total, it was layered. Goats may have provided milk, occasional meat, and eventually hides, but wild game still mattered. This was not yet an economy based on ownership. It was a flexible portfolio of food strategies, a bit of herding, a bit of gathering, a bit of old-fashioned chasing. And yet the implications were profound. Herding changes time. It makes people accountable to animals on a daily schedule. It encourages sedentism, even in minimal forms. It creates routine. Feed the goats, watch the goats, count the goats, kill the right ones. It also introduces new vulnerabilities: disease, overgrazing, the temptation to fence and privatize land. Herding was not a return to Eden. It was a recalibration of survival, one that carried new risks even as it promised new returns. One theory suggests that domesticated goats may have emerged not from direct intentionality, but from a feedback loop. Human trash supports goat presence. Human tolerance allows goat proximity. Goat presence necessitates more food and protection. This demands routines. Routines create familiarity, and eventually familiarity creates dependency, on both sides. Over time, what had once been prey becomes property, not because it was planned, but because it was easy. There is a strange irony here. The early goat herders of the Zagros in Anatolia likely did not think of themselves as doing anything revolutionary. They were responding to pressures: climatic shifts, declining game populations, increased competition for resources. Goats were a convenience, a backup, an option among many. But once that option became reliable, once it could be scaled, it began to reshape human lifeways, not abruptly, but steadily. This reshaping is visible not just in the bones of animals, but in the bones of people. Skeletal remains from this period show changes in mobility patterns, work-related stress, and possibly even diet. Herding demands walking, but not over vast distances. It compresses movement. It creates repetitive tasks: carrying fodder, milking, building enclosures, watching for predators. These new rhythms leave traces in joint wear, in footpath erosion, in how communities clustered their homes. And then there are the secondary effects. Animals bring parasites. Manure alters soil chemistry. Close contact creates zoonotic bridges, diseases that leap from hoof to hand. Domestication is not just a biological shift. It is an epidemiological one. Living with goats means living with their microbes, their waste, their cycles. It is an intimacy that leaves few parts of the human world untouched. But even here, it's important to be humble. The data is still sparse. Many of the details remain debated. Did domesticated goats first emerge in the Zagros or further west? Was there a single center of origin or multiple? How much genetic distance existed between early herded goats and wild populations? Were early people aware of what they were doing, or simply responding to short-term pressures with short-term strategies? These are questions science continues to explore, and there are no neat answers yet. What is becoming clearer, though, is that the domestication of animals was not a sudden shift, but a creeping transformation. One built on trash, tolerance, and trial. In those early mornings when someone rose to find their herd already waiting by the fire pit, something irreversible had begun. Not because they planned to change the world, but because the goats did not run. And that may be the real hinge point of this story. Domestication was not a conquest. It was an accommodation. A quiet agreement signed in hoofprints and smoke. And like many agreements, it came with clauses that no one fully read. We got milk, meat, and manure. The goats got safety, food, and a shadow version of freedom. And we both got something else. A new dependence. One that would follow us from the hills of Anatolia into every pasture, city, and empire to come. So the next time you see a goat in a field, standing still while the wind combs through its horns, remember, this animal was once wild, and it is still wild enough to leave if it wanted. But it doesn't. Not because it can't, but because 10,000 years ago it decided, just as we did, that there was something easier in staying close to the fire. And that decision, quiet as it was, changed everything. What changed when we stopped moving? For most of human existence, our ancestors lived in motion. They moved with the seasons, followed herds, tracked ripening berries and tubers through the landscape like a pulse. Their knowledge of the land was not theoretical. It was walked into their feet, burned into their calves, and passed between generations not through maps or records, but through steps. To move was to survive. and to survive was to belong to a living, shifting geography. But beginning roughly 10,500 years ago, something began to slow down. Across the Fertile Crescent and the hills of Upper Mesopotamia, communities started staying put, first for a season, then for a lifetime. The traces of this change lie buried in mud brick foundations and food waste. At sites like Jerf El Amar and Muribet, the signs are subtle but unmistakable. Thick middens full of animal bones and plant remains, grinding stones worn down to stumps, layers of ash and occupation debris building up over centuries, not scattered across wide-ranging campsites. These people were no longer foragers who moved. They were foragers who stayed. And then, bit by bit, they became something else entirely. Sedentism, the shift from a mobile to a settled lifestyle, was not a switch, it was a spectrum. But it brought with it profound changes, both physical and social. First came food storage. In earlier times, food was eaten soon after it was gathered or hunted. There was no reason to carry excess weight. But in permanent dwellings, storage became both possible and necessary. People dug pits into floors, built raised bins, and crafted sealed vessels from stone and clay. Barley, lentils, and nuts could be stored through the winter. Dried meat and fish became strategic reserves. This altered not just how people ate, but how they thought. The future, once abstract, became tangible. You could prepare for it, you could stockpile it, and for the first time you could hoard. Architecture followed suit. As dwellings became more durable, their form changed. Round huts gave way to rectangular rooms. Walls thickened, roofs flattened. Some houses included internal compartments for storage, hearths, and even designated sleeping areas. These were not temporary shelters. They were homes, and homes anchor people in ways that are hard to quantify. You do not build a stone threshold unless you plan to step over it again. You do not patch a roof unless you expect rain tomorrow. Dwellings changed time. They made it heavier. With permanence came consequence. Human bodies began to bear the signs of new labor. Sedentary life did not mean idleness. Quite the opposite. Farming settlements show high levels of repetitive strain. Knees worn from grinding, spines curved from lifting, hands warped by tools. Children grew up in dustier, more crowded environments, often with higher disease loads. Bones from these communities sometimes show signs of anemia, stunted growth, and other stress indicators. The world was no longer a horizon. It was a walled compound, and for all its stability, it came with a cost. But perhaps the most profound shift was demographic. Among mobile foragers, birth spacing was naturally regulated by lifestyle. Mothers nursed longer, carried infants over great distances, and needed years between pregnancies to maintain health. Sedentism broke this rhythm. With access to storable food and reduced movement, women could give birth more frequently. This led to higher fertility rates, faster population growth, and denser settlements. It also created new burdens. More children meant more caretaking, more mouths to feed, and more pressure on resources. Childhood itself changed. In mobile groups, children are socialized into a broad environment. They walk, climb, forage, and observe adults across a wide range of settings. In early sedentary settlements, childhood became more spatially confined. Play happened indoors or in narrow courtyards. Tasks were more repetitive. Roles became more fixed. The rhythms of life narrowed, like a song with fewer notes. And with the walls came boundaries, not just physical, but social. Where you lived began to define who you were. Kin groups settled near each other. Some areas of a settlement were used more than others. Garbage zones, storage zones, sleeping zones. This spatial order hints at emerging hierarchies, not full-blown inequality, but early prototypes, preferences, privileges, corners of permanence. What is striking about this period is how incremental the shift was. No single site tells the full story. Instead, across the Fertile Crescent, we see dozens of small communities experimenting with new ways of living. Some fail and vanish, others persist for centuries. There are no grand monuments here, no temples or kings, just people staying put, and in doing so, unknowingly reshaping the trajectory of human history. Because sedentism is not just a lifestyle, it is a feedback loop. The longer you stay, the more you build. The more you build, the harder it is to leave. And the harder it is to leave, the more you depend on what you have built. This loop tightens with every generation. By the time the first full-scale farming villages appear, the mobile world has already become a memory. Not erased, just less accessible. Even language may have shifted. Words for ownership, for inside and outside, for stay and go, they gain weight in a sedentary world. Memory becomes rooted in place, not path. Identity becomes tied to soil, not sky. The very idea of home changes, from a verb to a noun. And yet, for all this, the transition was not universal. Many groups remained mobile. Some returned to movement after experimenting with settlement. Others blended strategies, farming part of the year and ranging part of the year. The story is not one of linear progress, but of increasing entanglement. Sedentism did not replace the past, it layered over it. So what changed when we stopped moving? Nearly everything. How we ate, how we worked, how we raised children, how we aged, how we dreamed. But perhaps the deeper change was in scale. Movement keeps the world large, settlement makes it small. And in that smallness, that courtyard, that hearth, that wall, humanity found something both comforting and confining. We built homes to shelter ourselves, and in doing so, we built a world we could not easily walk away from. Why did farming come with so many more graves? It is not a rhetorical question, and it is not a question with a single answer either. But it is one of the most consistent patterns found in the archaeological record of early agricultural societies. When people stopped wandering, when they began planting instead of gathering, and when they built permanent homes instead of temporary campsites, something else started appearing in greater numbers too: children, graves, and signs of biological stress. It is one of the quiet truths about the so-called Neolithic revolution. The transition to farming was not just about food, it was about bodies. Bodies carried to term more often, born more frequently, buried more densely, and in many cases, surviving less well than before. We begin in what is now southeastern Anatolia and the Jordan Valley, between 9,500 and 8,500 years before the present. These were not the first places to experiment with agriculture, but they were among the first where the new way of life really took hold. Permanent villages, cultivated plots, domesticated animals. These societies were no longer testing the waters of farming, they were swimming in it. And the effect on population was immense. This period marks what anthropologists call the first demographic transition. In foraging societies, birth intervals are often long. Children are spaced out by necessity. Mobility demands it, energy constraints reinforce it, and prolonged breastfeeding naturally suppresses fertility. But with the advent of sedentary life and reliable food storage, those constraints began to lift. Mothers could wean earlier. They could afford, in theory, to raise more than one child at a time. Fertility rates increased. The number of births per woman rose sharply, and the size of settlements began to swell. At sites like Şayonu and Jericho, archaeologists have noted both architectural continuity and population intensification. The density of buildings increases. So does the density of burials. And in these graves we begin to see a new profile of mortality. More infants, more young children, and more skeletal signs of chronic stress. Cemeteries from this period paint a different picture than those of earlier mobile groups. In Paleolithic and Epipaleolithic hunter-gatherer contexts, burials are relatively rare, often isolated, and distributed thinly across landscapes. But in the early Neolithic, we see clusters of graves, sometimes beneath house floors, sometimes in designated communal areas, sometimes even stacked in layers. The dead were not just buried, they were integrated into the architecture of the living. And among those buried, a striking proportion were children. In some Neolithic sites, over 40% of the burials are of individuals under the age of 5. That is not because people loved their children more or memorialized them more deliberately. It is because child mortality increased. Why? There are multiple culprits. One is nutrition. Although agriculture increased the total caloric yield of a landscape, it narrowed the diversity of foods. Diets became more monotonous. Reliance on cereals introduced deficiencies, especially in iron and other micronutrients. We see the skeletal echoes of this in the form of porotic hyperostosis, cribra orbitalia, and linear enamel hypoplasia. These are not just technical phrases. They are the fossilized scars of anemia, nutritional stress, and arrested growth, and they show up frequently in children. Another culprit is disease. Sedentism creates density. Density creates transmission. As people clustered together in larger numbers, and as animals began living closer to human dwellings, the microbial environment changed. Pathogens that would have burned out in small, dispersed foraging groups could now sustain themselves in bigger populations. And children, with their developing immune systems, bore the brunt of it. There is also the issue of waste. The archaeological record begins to show evidence of refuse pits, middens, and sustained garbage accumulation around Neolithic settlements. This, too, is new. Mobile groups tend to leave minimal environmental footprints. They move before waste builds up. But permanent villages do not. They sit in their own trash, quite literally. And in these unsanitary conditions, diarrheal disease, parasitic infections, and other health burdens become endemic. It is difficult to measure the full extent of maternal stress in this period, but the clues are there. Skeletal remains of adult females often show pelvic deformation consistent with repeated childbirth. Vertebral compression, joint wear, and nutritional indicators also point to physically demanding lives, made harder by the demands of multiple pregnancies and heavy workloads. There are other social consequences too. The presence of so many child burials, often in or near domestic spaces, suggests that death became part of the household rhythm. Children died, and they were buried where they had lived. It is a sobering thought. In some cases, tiny graves show signs of care, ornaments, red ochre, carefully positioned bodies. But in others, the burial seems hurried. A pit, a small body, covered and forgotten. None of this is to say that farming societies were heartless or that hunter-gatherer life was a paradise. But the demographic and epidemiological shift is real. It is written in the bones. More people, more children, more disease, more graves. Farming made populations grow, but it also made them more vulnerable. One might ask why the system persisted. If the health costs were so high, why didn't people abandon it? That is where momentum and social entrenchment begin to matter. Once population densities rise, the option to return to foraging diminishes. The land around you is occupied. The wild resources are overused. Your neighbors are no longer mobile bands, but other villages. The system becomes self-reinforcing. And perhaps, too, the calculus was more complicated than we imagine. Even if mortality increased, even if childhood disease spiked, the overall reproductive rate was still high. More children were dying, but more were being born too. And in the long run, some survived. Enough to grow the village. Enough to make the graves more numerous. Enough to change the world. If there is a haunting question to carry forward, it is this. What did it feel like to be among the first to live in a world of crowds, cries, and illness? To know that food was more secure, but life somehow more fragile. The bones do not answer that, but the silence between the graves might. There are places so ancient that time forgets to cover them, not because they are hidden beneath layers of soil, but because even time itself isn't quite sure what to make of them. Göbekli Tepe is one of those places, buried for thousands of years, and then, suddenly, unearthed with its stone circles still standing. It felt like a riddle from a vanished world. And perhaps it is. Because what if our ancestors gathered to build temples long before they gathered to plant seeds? First discovered in the mid-1990s on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe consists of massive stone enclosures, each formed by upright T-shaped pillars carved from limestone, some standing over 5 meters tall. These aren't the crude markers of survival or shelters from the wind. They are carefully arranged in circular or oval formations, many decorated with intricate reliefs of animals, foxes, birds, snakes, wild boars, and abstract symbols that no one has yet deciphered. And it gets stranger. These structures date to between 9,500 and 8,000 years before the Common Era, well before the full emergence of settled agricultural village life in this region. This alone forces us to rethink what came first: food or faith, settlement or ceremony. For decades, archaeologists assumed that complex societies only arose after the invention of farming. That surplus food allowed for labor specialization, monumental architecture, and religion. Göbekli Tepe flips that model on its head. Here, It seems that the first monumental architecture appeared not as a byproduct of agriculture, but possibly as a prelude to it. And while the site has no evidence of domestic structures, no houses, no streets, no long-term living spaces, it does show signs of repeated use, deliberate burial, and careful reconstruction over centuries. This raises a question that we are still struggling to answer. Who built Göbekli Tepe, and why? These were pre-pottery Neolithic people, still using stone tools, still relying largely on wild resources. They were, as far as we can tell, not yet full-time farmers. Yet they moved and shaped multi-ton stones with astonishing coordination. That suggests something powerful enough to rally effort and cooperation without the usual levers of centralized states, military force, or even urban infrastructure. Some theories focus on ritual. Perhaps this was a sanctuary for seasonal gatherings. Others suggest feasting. There is evidence of large-scale animal processing, wild gazelles and aurochs mostly, and thousands of discarded flint tools. These could have been festival sites, tied to seasonal rhythms, migrations, or ritual cycles. If so, then perhaps it wasn't farming that first demanded community effort, but belief, shared myth, a place to return to, a reason to come back, and the cooperation required to build it? That may be the key. Before full-scale agriculture, humans still needed to coordinate. But what brings together foragers scattered across a landscape with no binding economic structure? Maybe symbols do. Maybe shared ceremonies, animal totems, and cosmologies carved into stone. It is tempting, though speculative, to imagine Göbekli Tepe as a kind of ideological glue, a place that helped early groups form bonds, test alliances, and experiment with collaboration on a scale not seen before. But not all questions find easy answers. Why were these enclosures buried, deliberately covered in layers of rubble? Was it an act of closure, a ritual retirement, or something else? Why are the carvings so specific yet unreadable? The vultures, the scorpions, the headless figures. Are they myth? Warning? Art? There are places so ancient that time forgets to cover them. Not because they are hidden beneath layers of soil, but because even time itself isn't quite sure what to make of them. Göbekli Tepe is one of those places, buried for thousands of years and then, suddenly, unearthed with its stone circles still standing. It felt like a riddle from a vanished world. And perhaps it is. Because what if our ancestors gathered to build temples long before they gathered to plant seeds? First discovered in the mid-1990s on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe consists of massive stone enclosures, each formed by upright T-shaped pillars carved from limestone, some standing over 5 meters tall. These aren't the crude markers of survival or shelters from the wind. They are carefully arranged in circular or oval formations, many decorated with intricate reliefs of animals, foxes, birds, snakes, wild boars, and abstract symbols that no one has yet deciphered. And it gets stranger. These structures date to between 9,500 and 8,000 years before the Common Era, well before the full emergence of settled agricultural village life in this region. This alone forces us to rethink what came first: food or faith, settlement or ceremony. For decades, archaeologists assumed that complex societies only arose after the invention of farming. That surplus food allowed for labor specialization, monumental architecture, and religion. Göbekli Tepe flips that model on its head. Here, it seems that the first monumental architecture appeared not as a byproduct of agriculture, but possibly as a prelude to it. And while the site has no evidence of domestic structures, no houses, no streets, no long-term living spaces, it does show signs of repeated use, deliberate burial, and careful reconstruction over centuries. This raises a question that we are still struggling to answer. Who built Göbekli Tepe, and why? These were pre-pottery Neolithic people, still using stone tools, still relying largely on wild resources. They were, as far as we can tell, not yet full-time farmers. Yet they moved and shaped multi-ton stones with astonishing coordination. That suggests something powerful enough to rally effort and cooperation without the usual levers of centralized states, military force, or even urban infrastructure. Some theories focus on ritual. Perhaps this was a sanctuary for seasonal gatherings. Others suggest feasting. There is evidence of large-scale animal processing, wild gazelles and aurochs mostly, and thousands of discarded flint tools. These could have been festival sites, tied to seasonal rhythms, migrations, or ritual cycles. If so, then perhaps it wasn't farming that first demanded community effort, but belief, shared myth, a place to return to, a reason to come back. And the cooperation required to build it, that may be the key. Before full-scale agriculture, humans still needed to coordinate. But what brings together foragers scattered across a landscape with no binding economic structure? Maybe symbols do, maybe shared ceremonies, animal totems, and cosmologies carved into stone. It is tempting, though speculative, to imagine Göbekli Tepe as a kind of ideological glue, a place that helped early groups form bonds, test alliances, and experiment with collaboration on a scale not seen before. But not all questions find easy answers. Why were these enclosures buried, deliberately covered in layers of rubble? Was it an act of closure, a ritual retirement, or something else? Why are the carvings so specific yet unreadable? The vultures, the scorpions, the headless figures, are they myth, warning, art? Some researchers suggest the site reflects an early form of religion, not necessarily organized but already rich with meaning. Others argue that it represents social signaling, a way to impress, intimidate, or display cohesion. After all, monumentality always carries messages, whether about ancestors, order, or control. And even if no permanent population lived here, the labor and coordination involved imply a degree of logistical planning. Perhaps proto-farmers tested their abilities here. Perhaps building the pillars helped teach the cooperation that later made full agriculture possible. Of course, these are models, hypotheses. What we do know is more limited. No writing, no burials, no nearby settlements of comparable scale. The surrounding sites show varied subsistence strategies, often still focused on wild grains and game, which means Göbekli Tepe didn't arise in isolation, but as part of a mosaic of shifting behaviors, somewhere between mobility and permanence, between foraging and farming. And in that sense, it stands as a symbol of transition, not from one way of life to another, but of the space in between, where human behavior was messy, layered, non-linear, where people could gather to build without staying to plant, where meaning came not from daily survival, but from something harder to define, awe perhaps, or memory, or simply the joy of building something too heavy to move. In the end, Göbekli Tepe may not be the first temple, it may not even be a temple, but it is a turning point in how we think about ourselves. It reminds us that people didn't become human only when they farmed, settled, or wrote things down. They were already doing human things long before, and it leaves us with a quiet, unanswered question. What other meanings have we buried without knowing we once held them? Some buildings are too large for one person to claim, too practical for gods, too plain for kings. They don't stand out with dramatic carvings or tower over the horizon, and yet their presence is undeniable. Long before palaces or pyramids, our ancestors built rooms that looked like storage bins, pits that smelled like old grain, and circular halls that seated no rulers. And in the quiet, sturdy shapes of these early communal spaces, something world-changing was taking root. Not just the storing of food, but the storing of trust. The first architecture of agreement. By around 9,000 years before the Common Era, in places like Jerf el Ahmar in modern Syria, and the Wadi Fainan in what is now Jordan, archaeologists began to find something unusual. These weren't villages dominated by family homes or towering shrines, but small clusters of buildings where some spaces stood out for being shared. Granaries, often built in central areas and deliberately separated from sleeping quarters, show signs of repeated use and architectural care. Thick walls, raised platforms, ventilation, all the traits of people who were serious about protecting a surplus. But the surplus wasn't private, at least not yet. It's hard to know exactly how these spaces functioned. Were they literal banks of grain collectively owned and administered for the group, or were they controlled by a select few, the earliest seed hoarders? Either way, what we see in these sites is cooperation embedded in stone. The need not only to survive season by season, but to plan, store, anticipate. Some researchers argue that these buildings represent a kind of social safety net, a way to smooth over the unpredictability of harvests, of rainfall, of hunting luck. A good harvest year might help feed a neighboring clan during a bad one, and in return, they'd remember. This wasn't charity. It was mutual insurance, tracked not in coins but in memories and promises. At Jerf el Ahmar, one structure stood out. Circular, sunken slightly into the earth, it was built with care, well-plastered floors, benches around the interior, and a central post. No hearth, no signs of sleeping, no animal bones. Whatever happened here, it wasn't daily life. Some have called it a council house, a kind of early meeting hall, a place where disputes might be resolved, decisions made, or maybe just where people gathered to share food and stories. And food, always, seems to be at the center. The presence of storage and meeting spaces side by side suggests that cooperation and calories were already deeply entangled. This is where the debate begins, because cooperation, while beautiful, isn't always equal. Storing grain for the community might mean protecting everyone. It might also mean controlling access. Who holds the key? Who decides what is shared and when? Some anthropologists point out that granaries may have been the first institutions of power. Before walls marked property, before names marked inheritance, the simple act of guarding stored food could begin to shape hierarchy. It's speculation, but a haunting one. That generosity and control might have walked hand in hand from the very beginning. But perhaps it's better to resist neat stories. These early communities were likely small, fluid, and still deeply tied to foraging rhythms. Full-time farming had not yet swept across the land. People planted, yes, but they also gathered, hunted, moved. The buildings we find may reflect cooperation in its experimental phase. Not a top-down command structure, but trial and error arrangements. How do we live together when we have more than we can eat in one sitting? How do we avoid waste, or theft, or famine? It's also worth asking what made this possible in the first place. The answer, most likely, is climate. The onset of the Holocene brought a relative calm to rainfall and temperature across the Near East. This allowed people, for the first time in generations, to begin betting on the future, to store without losing it all to mold, rot, or scavengers. In a world where weather was no longer entirely unpredictable, architecture could start to look forward. Rooms could be built for next season, not just tonight. And once that shift begins, the shift toward thinking beyond the immediate, new social questions arise. How do you keep track of who contributed? Who eats how much? What if someone refuses to share? These aren't idle concerns. They're the foundations of everything from etiquette to economics. The storage room becomes a political space. The meeting hall becomes a theater of fairness, or resentment, or ritual. What's remarkable is how long this phase seems to have lasted. Across sites from the Euphrates to the Jordan Valley, we see a recurring theme: people building together, storing together, and experimenting with the rhythms of shared survival. It's not yet full civilization, but it is certainly more than wandering bands. A middle space. Not quite egalitarian, not yet stratified. A fragile web of cooperation woven from stored seed and mutual dependence. And yet, even here, questions remain. Who cleaned the granary? Who guarded it at night? Was participation truly voluntary, or quietly enforced by norms, stories, and pressure? Did those who stored more get more back, or was sharing unconditional? The archaeological record is mute on these details, but the shadows of these questions linger in the very shapes of the rooms. At Wadi Fainan, some granaries were hidden inside houses, while others stood apart. This split may reflect the tension between household storage and community storage, between keeping food for your own kin and entrusting it to the group. It's a tension that will eventually lead to deeper divides. But for now, it seems the experiment held. People built big, not to glorify a leader, but to share, to coordinate, to try living differently. The most understated revolution in human history may have happened inside these plain, circular buildings. Not with a bang, not with conquest, but with a pile of seeds in a cool room. And with a memory that we once chose to build something for everyone, even when we didn't yet have much. The weight of that choice still echoes. So the question is not just whether food brought us together, but whether it also locked us in. Not in chains, but in dependencies, in expectations, in systems that, once built, were hard to walk away from. A room full of grain is a beautiful thing, but it also demands a lock, a record, a watcher. And once the door closes behind that first full storage bin, the world outside begins to feel a little more distant, a little more wild, a little harder to return to. The moment you build a wall, you draw a line between what is yours and what is not. It sounds simple, almost benign, But walls do more than keep things in. They define exclusion. And in the early days of farming, that was a radical idea. Because for most of our species' history, land wasn't something you could own. It was something you moved through, something you shared, something you belonged to. But when people began to settle, to plant, to stay, the land itself began to shift. Not just physically, but conceptually. And what followed was perhaps the most enduring and unresolved invention of all: private property. Between 9,000 and 8,000 years before the Common Era, in the hills of central Anatolia and the floodplains of Mesopotamia, people were starting to do something strange. They were building walls not just around houses, but around things that did not move. Grain, yes, that had already begun, but also space, plots, pathways, even voids. The architecture of this period reveals more than shelter. It reveals negotiation. Because now, where you planted mattered. And so did the fact that you had planted at all. At places like Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, the pattern becomes almost claustrophobic. Homes pressed tightly together with no streets, no obvious doors. Entry was from the roof. And yet, inside each dwelling there was increasing differentiation. Storage bins carved into corners, hearths that faced specific directions, floors built up layer after layer, sometimes for centuries. This was not just shelter, it was inheritance, continuity. And perhaps most telling of all, the dead were buried beneath the floors. Ancestors quite literally beneath the feet of the living, tying families to place through blood and bone. Elsewhere, in the flatter expanses of Mesopotamia, early signs of field boundaries begin to emerge. These aren't fences in the modern sense, but they are lines etched in practice, paths worn by repeated steps, drainage channels redirected by human hands, and perhaps most importantly, the silent agreements that must have held them in place. If someone returned to the same plot year after year, harvested the same grove, or channeled water down the same trench, at what point did it stop being shared and start being theirs? Archaeology can only go so far in answering that. We don't have deeds or contracts from this period. We don't even have consistent signs of conflict. But we do have space, and how people used it changed dramatically in this era. The very concept of place began to tighten. Land was no longer infinite. It was bordered, useful, and once it was worked, it became worth protecting. This is the quiet emergence of property, not through laws, but through routines. If you sow the seed and reap the grain, you remember the effort. And if someone else reaps your grain, you remember that too. Soon, memory needs reinforcement, a hedge, a rock line, a ditch, and from there, the mental map of ownership begins to grow. These are my fields, that is your grove. We meet at the well, but we plant apart. Some anthropologists argue that this phase was critical, not because it introduced conflict, which it may have, but because it required negotiation. Early farmers had to invent new ways of managing space, shared paths through planted land, agreements about planting order, harvest times, water access. We don't know the words they used, but the fact that these early communities persisted suggests they found some way to manage the tension. Yet the tension was real. Once land becomes productive, it also becomes valuable. And once it's valuable, others might want it. This doesn't mean people immediately began fighting, but it does mean they had to invent boundaries, social, spatial, and probably symbolic. Some sites suggest increasing ritual around place, markers left at thresholds, figurines buried near walls. Were these protective charms, territorial signs, memories made visible? We don't know, but the impulse to mark what is yours runs deep. And it wasn't just land. Tools, too, became more fixed. Grinding stones, once carried between camps, were now often too large to move. Storage bins were built into walls. Clay tokens, perhaps the first accounting devices, begin to appear, possibly tracking commodities or obligations. These aren't yet coins, but they are steps toward abstraction, toward the idea that value can move even when things don't. Property, in this sense, may not have begun with greed, but with continuity. The desire to know that your work will feed your children, that your grove will be there next year, that your ancestors are not forgotten beneath another's floor. And so systems emerged, slowly, unevenly, to make that continuity feel real, through wall, stone, memory, and perhaps the first glimmers of obligation. Of course, not all land was equal. Soil fertility varied. water was not always nearby, and in regions like the northern Fertile Crescent, rainfall was just predictable enough to risk planting, but not guaranteed. This made successful plots even more valuable. Not in money, there was none, but in survival. A family that could count on its field had margin, and margin, in uncertain times, is power. Still, it would be a mistake to imagine this shift as a sudden descent into selfishness. The archaeological record doesn't show sudden inequality or mass conflict here. What it shows is complexity, people trying to live together while staying put. And staying put, it turns out, is harder than wandering, because the land remembers. So do neighbors. And when every harvest depends on invisible lines in the dirt, trust becomes as important as rain. Some researchers suggest that early property was communal within households, but negotiated between them. This makes sense in clustered settlements. You might not own the path to the well, but you might expect your neighbor not to plant too close. These expectations likely evolved into norms, stories, maybe even taboos. In time, they might become law. But at this stage, they are still fluid, still negotiable, still vulnerable. What about those without land? The young, the newly arrived, the unlucky. That is harder to trace. Perhaps they worked as dependents within larger households. Perhaps they moved on. Or perhaps they tested the system, pressing its limits, planting a field just over the hill, seeing who noticed. This murkiness, this in-between space, is what makes the period so fascinating. Because it's not yet rule-bound. It's still human, still messy. And through all of this, the land itself was changing. Repeated planting alters soil. Irrigation leaves salts behind. Trees fall. Grasses retreat. The first whispers of anthropogenic landscape change begin here. Not catastrophic, but cumulative. And as the land shifts, so do people's relationships with it. A field isn't just dirt. It's history, labor, identity. In some cases, even burial. It's easy to forget how radical this all was. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had moved with the seasons, followed game, gathered what ripened. The idea that land could be carved up, claimed, and defended wasn't part of that world, but now it was starting to be. Not through conquest, but through calendars, through expectation, through the quiet logic of mine. So what do you do when someone else wants what you've planted? What if they say their grandparents worked this land too? What if the rains fail and your neighbor's field still grows tall? The answers to these questions would shape the next 10,000 years. But at this point in history, they were still being figured out, season by season, harvest by harvest, wall by wall. And perhaps that's the haunting question. Not just how property began, but whether it could have gone another way. Could we have stored food without drawing lines? Planted fields without claiming ownership? Lived together without dividing the earth beneath us? We don't know. But we live in the world built by those first walls, and they are still standing, in ways we barely see. There's a quiet moment when the food comes in, baskets full of barley, pulses drying on woven mats, meat stripped and hung to cure. It's a moment of success, of survival. But then the questions begin. Who stores it? Who guards it? Who gets to eat first? For most of our species' time on Earth, these questions hardly came up. People hunted, gathered, and shared what they found because no one could afford not to. But once food stayed still, once it piled up, once the harvest could be measured in months instead of hours, power followed it. And where power gathers, inequality tends to grow. By around 8,800 to 8,000 years before the Common Era, in places like Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia and Tel Abu Hureyra in the Euphrates Basin, the world was already shifting. Farming had not yet taken over completely, but it was no longer an experiment. Plants like wheat, barley, and lentils were being cultivated year after year. Goats had begun to turn from prey into livestock, and people, or at least some people, were starting to live not just with more food, but with more than others. This wasn't a revolution. It was a slow drift. Archaeologists don't find palaces or thrones in this period, but they do find difference. And in the quiet strata of buried homes and clustered graves, that difference begins to speak. At Çatalhöyük, the dwellings appear similar at first glance, tightly packed, entered from rooftops, each with its own hearth and storage bins. But not all homes are equal. Some have more rooms, some have richer plastering and wall paintings, some contain more buried individuals beneath their floors. And among these burials, some bodies come with gifts, stone beads, obsidian blades, carved figurines. Others lie alone, untouched, even unnamed. What explains the difference? Age, achievement, ancestry? It's hard to say, but the fact that difference exists at all is the key. Inequality doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in who gets remembered, who gets mourned, and who gets nothing. And while we can't ask the people of Çatalhöyük who decided who got what, the evidence suggests that memory and food were both becoming selective. At Tel Abu Huraira, the story runs parallel but not identical. This site, perched near what was once the Euphrates River's edge, began as a hunter-gatherer settlement in the late Epipaleolithic. But by the early Neolithic, it was undergoing transformation. Domesticated plants and animals became central, mud brick houses replaced temporary shelters, and skeletal remains began to tell a different tale. Wear patterns on bones, especially in feet, knees, and spines, suggest repetitive labor, particularly in women. Grinding grain on stone querns, kneeling for hours, carrying heavy loads. The strain etched into their skeletons isn't just a medical note, it's a social one. Because while men's remains also show signs of work, the distribution and nature of wear is uneven, labor had become gendered, and with it perhaps the earliest signs that power did not fall evenly on all shoulders. Then there's diet. Isotopic studies of Neolithic remains can now reveal more than age and ancestry. They can show what people ate, and how much. In some communities, individuals buried with more elaborate goods also appear to have eaten better. More meat, more protein, more access to the good stuff. It's not definitive, but it's suggestive, because once food is stored, it can be rationed, and once it's rationed, someone decides. This raises a profound and uncomfortable question. Did farming create inequality, or merely expose it? Foragers can be deeply cooperative, but they are not always egalitarian. Dominance and deference exist in all primate societies. But farming made the stakes higher. When surplus food exists, someone can control access. When homes stay in one place, someone can inherit more. And when labor is divided, someone usually gets the harder job. That doesn't mean everyone was miserable. There is still plenty of evidence of community life in these early villages. Shared ovens, open courtyards, decorative art, music instruments, clay figurines. Life was likely rich, layered, and full of meaning, but it was no longer flat. Some people, or households, seem to have risen above others, subtly but steadily. The mechanisms of that rise remain mysterious. No writing exists to tell us how decisions were made. We don't have lists of rulers, tax records, or laws. But material patterns tell their own story. In certain homes, obsidian becomes more frequent, a material prized for its sharpness and luster, but requiring long-distance trade. In some graves, shell beads from distant coasts appear. These items speak of networks, of connections, of someone having the ability to get what others could not. Whether through trade, ritual status, charisma, or coercion, difference was accumulating. Even in the figurines, clues hide. Many of the female-shaped sculptures from Çatalhöyük are stylized and repetitive. Wide hips, prominent breasts, seated postures. Are these goddesses, ancestors, fertility symbols? We don't know. But their consistency suggests shared beliefs. And shared beliefs can support social hierarchies, especially when tied to lineage or ritual roles. Still, it's important not to project later hierarchies backwards. This wasn't yet royalty or bureaucracy. No stone thrones, no massive storehouses with guards. The inequality of this period was more like a slope than a cliff, gradual, variable, often invisible until you look closely. But it was growing. One particularly haunting clue comes from burial demographics. In some settlements, children's graves appear disproportionately rich in goods. At first, this seems odd. Why would children, too young to have accomplished much, receive such attention? The likely answer is that status was becoming inherited. Wealth and memory were being passed down, not just from person to person, but across generations. The slow creep of dynastic logic had begun, and that may be the most significant shift of all. When inequality becomes generational, it hardens. When what you are born into matters more than what you do, the future narrows. And in some of these early farming villages, we may be seeing that narrowing for the first time. Even the layout of space reflects change. In earlier mobile societies, camps were fluid, restructured as needed. But in Çatalhöyük and its contemporaries, homes were rebuilt on the same footprint for centuries. Some grew more complex, others did not. Over time, the very architecture of the village encoded memory, and perhaps privilege. Of course, these interpretations come with caution. Not every difference is dominance. Not every burial good means power. And not every architectural choice reflects hierarchy. But the trend, across multiple sites and lines of evidence, is hard to ignore. Once food piled up, once homes stayed put, once memory was fixed to place, people began to sort themselves, or be sorted, in new ways. And yet there was no single cause. Inequality did not erupt like a volcano. It seeped in like groundwater, through habit, through inheritance, through convenience. If someone stored more grain, others might rely on them. If someone could host a feast, others might follow. If someone held knowledge of planting times, of ritual paths, of ancestral stories, others might defer. And deference, once established, is hard to reverse. There is no evidence that the people of Çatalhöyük or Tel Abu Hureyra imagined themselves as unequal. They likely saw themselves as a community. But within that community, roles were emerging. And some roles held more goods, more memory, more power. So what happens when food becomes more than survival? When it becomes leverage? That's the haunting question that echoes from these early sites. Because the seeds of inequality were not sown by accident. They were sown in surplus. And once surplus exists, so does selection. We may never know who decided who got to eat first, but the bones, the tools, the rooms, and the graves all suggest that someone did. And once that began, the world we know, stratified, structured, and hungry for more, had already started to take shape. What really happened when farmers met foragers? The question sounds simple enough. It conjures images of clashing cultures, planted fields encroaching on wild forests, strangers arriving with seeds in their pockets and pottery in their hands. But when we look closely, not just at tools or ruins, but at the DNA left behind in the bones, the story unfolds more slowly and more gently. It turns out the Great Migration out of the Fertile Crescent into Europe was not a conquest. It was something quieter, slower, stranger. Beginning sometime around 8,800 years before the Common Era, a gradual wave began to rise from the eastern highlands and the northern reaches of the Fertile Crescent. These were not armies. They were families, small groups of early farmers moving bit by bit, up through Anatolia, across the Bosporus, and into the Balkans. They carried with them more than just grain. They brought a new relationship with the land, cultivated wheat and barley, tamed goats and sheep, clay pots, groundstone axes, and the memory of generations who had already begun to shape a new kind of human life, one tethered to place, to planting seasons, to a world in which food came from soil rather than from chance. But Europe was not empty. Across the river valleys, hilltops, and forest edges of the Balkans and beyond, foragers still lived as they had for tens of thousands of years. They hunted red deer, fished along lake shores, gathered hazelnuts and wild berries, and moved with the rhythms of the land. Their ancestors had painted caves, buried their dead with ochre, and survived the great glacial retreats. They had no need for plows. And yet, over time, they too would change. How exactly that change happened, how farmers and foragers met, mingled, and eventually merged, is one of the central mysteries of the early Neolithic in Europe. And only recently, with the help of ancient DNA and population modeling, have we started to glimpse answers. Not full ones, but pieces. For decades, the prevailing image was one of replacement, that agriculture spread through population movement, displacing or overwhelming local foragers. After all, the material culture shifted. Farming villages appeared where none had stood before. Pottery styles changed, tools changed, diets changed. But bones are patient. And when scientists began to sequence the genomes from early Neolithic skeletons across Europe, they discovered something more complex. In the earliest wave, those first farmers who settled in the Balkans, the genetic profile closely matched people from Anatolia and the Near East. This suggests that the initial spread was, indeed, driven largely by movement. But not long after, the pattern began to shift. By the time these farming communities reached Central Europe, around 7,500 to 7,000 years before the Common Era, a blend had begun. The genomes from these Middle Neolithic people show traces of European foragers, not many at first, but steadily increasing over time. What does this mean? It means that farming did not sweep across Europe like a tidal wave. It filtered in like water through soil. At first, the two groups remained genetically distinct. Farmers stayed farmers. Foragers stayed foragers. They lived near each other but not with each other. The tools found at their sites reflect different lives. One group built houses and granaries. The other continued to move seasonally, hunting and gathering. But somewhere along the way, the walls began to come down. Intermarriage began. Children were born of both traditions. The reasons for this blending are hard to pin down. Was it trade that brought them together? A shared feast? A child from one group taken in by another after a harsh winter? Or was it simply time? When two populations live near each other for centuries, the boundaries start to blur, especially when one offers something the other finds useful, and both had much to offer. Farming brought food security, at least in theory, but foraging brought deep knowledge of the land, of plants, of game, of what to do when the crops failed. The earliest European farmers often struggled when first settling new terrain. Their toolkits were suited to the dry summers and open hills of Anatolia. But in the wetter, more forested lands of Europe, they had to adapt. And for that, they may have needed help. Help from those who had always lived there. Help from foragers. Some sites suggest this directly. In parts of the Balkans, we find settlements that contain a blend of artifacts, domesticated grains alongside wild animal bones, pottery in the same layer as Mesolithic-style microliths. The walls between lifeways were porous, and in the mitochondrial DNA, passed down through maternal lines, we see increasing signs of admixture. Forager women entering farming communities, farming daughters marrying into local groups? We don't know, but the mingling is clear. Interestingly, the blending was not uniform. In some areas, particularly the forested north, local forager ancestry persisted longer and mixed more deeply. In others, especially where fertile plains made farming easier, the newcomers' genes dominated longer. This patchwork tells us something important. There was no single story, no single strategy. The spread of farming across Europe was not a monolith. It was 1,000 tiny negotiations, alliances, experiments. And yet, the overall arc held. By around 7,000 years before the Common Era, farming had spread across much of southeastern and central Europe. Wheat, barley, peas, and lentils were now being cultivated far from their origins. Goats and sheep grazed in places where aurochs once roamed free. And the children being born were no longer simply the descendants of one group or another. They were both. Hybrids, carriers of two worlds. This was not always a peaceful process, but nor was it uniformly violent. The absence of widespread fortifications, at least in the early phases, suggests that farmers and foragers often coexisted without war. There may have been tensions, there may have been boundaries, but the archaeological record does not scream of large-scale conflict. It hums instead with complexity. One of the more intriguing insights comes from demogenomic modeling, a way of simulating population dynamics over time using genetic and archaeological data. These models suggest that the initial farming expansion moved faster than expected, followed by periods of slower integration. That aligns with the archaeological pattern: a pulse of migration, then a pause, then gradual local blending. What also emerges is that farming didn't always succeed. Some early farming settlements were abandoned, others shrank. The land wasn't always cooperative, and when crops failed, it's likely that those who still knew how to forage had the advantage. This may have encouraged cultural exchange, not out of goodwill, but out of necessity. When winter is long and food is short, people learn from whoever has survived. In some ways, the spread of farming into Europe is best understood not as a replacement, but as a partnership, uneven, asymmetrical, often reluctant, but still a partnership. The descendants of this period, the people who would go on to shape the later Neolithic, the Bronze Age, and beyond, were not purely farmers or foragers. They were both. And in that mixture, something new was born. What's also striking is how long this blending took. In some regions, it unfolded over many centuries. In others, it may have taken millennia. Cultural inertia is strong. People do not give up old ways easily, nor do they adopt new ones without reason. But generation by generation, the mosaic shifted. This slow dance between seed and forest, between home and hunt, shaped the genetic and cultural foundations of Europe, not through war, but through contact, not through conquest, but through curiosity, intermarriage, and perhaps shared meals. There are no statues to commemorate it, no names, no stories passed down with clarity. But in the DNA of modern Europeans, the legacy is still there, a ghost of mingling, a faint echo of two lifeways brushing against each other and deciding, for reasons now lost, to try something new together. And that leaves us with one last question. If farming was not imposed, but adopted and adapted, what does that say about us? That change, even the biggest kind, may happen not with a shout, but with a quiet yes. A child born of two stories, a new path, not chosen all at once, but walked step by step, in fields, in forests, and in the spaces in between. Did farming spread by foot or by sail? For much of the 20th century, the assumption leaned heavily toward the former. The standard image was of early agriculturalists walking across river valleys and highland corridors, planting seeds as they went. The spread of farming, it was thought, followed predictable inland routes, along the Danube, through the Balkans, across Anatolia, and up into Central Europe. But then came a different kind of evidence: seeds showing up on islands, domesticated animals appearing on coastlines where the inland connection seemed improbable, pottery styles matching across great stretches of water. It started to seem like the sea had played a far larger role in the early farming story than anyone had comfortably accounted for. And suddenly the puzzle became more complicated. Because the moment you include boats, you're no longer dealing with the slow push of people on foot. You're dealing with people who could skip whole mountain ranges, people who understood tides, weather, and wind, people who, thousands of years before the supposed age of sailors, were already shaping the coastlines with agriculture. By 8,500 years before the Common Era, domesticated plants and animals were not just creeping their way across the land, they were arriving on islands. The Aegean archipelago, the Dodecanese, Cyprus, all of these show signs of early Neolithic presence. And not just presence, but coordination. You don't get goats, sheep, wheat, barley, and obsidian showing up together on an island without someone planning for it. It's one thing to plant a few seeds and hope they grow. It's another to load animals onto boats and cross open water. This is not a half measure. It's a strategy. Which means that at least some of these early farming populations were not just farmers. They were seafarers. Take Cyprus, for example. It lies over 100 kilometers from the nearest mainland. And yet archaeological layers there show a full Neolithic package: cereals, legumes, domesticated pigs and cattle, stone tools, and circular architecture. Some of the earliest sites, like Chalurocambos, date to the early 9th millennium BCE, placing them firmly in the range of early Near Eastern agricultural expansion. The people who settled Cyprus weren't dabbling. They brought with them the full toolkit. But there's more. The genetics of the animals suggest they were not wild stock captured locally, but already domesticated breeds brought from the mainland. And once on the island, those populations were carefully managed, bred, and sustained. This was not improvisation, it was colonization. Not in the imperial sense, but in the ecological one. These people were bringing a whole way of life across the sea. The same is true, though less dramatically, in the Aegean Islands. Crete, the Cyclades, and the Dodecanese all show signs of early farming communities by around 8,000 to 7,500 years before the Common Era. Often the material culture resembles that of Western Anatolia. Similar tools, similar pottery, similar house forms. But with a twist. Some of the techniques suggest adaptations to local conditions. These were not just migrants copying what they had done before. They were adjusting, innovating, trying new approaches in new landscapes. What makes the coastal routes so interesting is not just the logistics, though those are fascinating in their own right. It's the fact that they offer an entirely different rhythm of Neolithic spread. Rather than crawling across terrain, these maritime farmers could hop from island to island, bringing agriculture to places far ahead of the inland wave. And because coasts are dynamic environments, Rich in resources but often challenging for standard dry farming, these communities may have experimented with hybrid strategies. Some cultivated small plots, others relied heavily on shellfish, fish, and wild plants. The Neolithic along the sea was not a single model, but a spectrum. There's also the matter of the boats themselves. We don't have physical remains of these early vessels. Organic materials rarely preserve over thousands of years in salty environments, but indirect evidence suggests they must have existed. The distances covered, the coordination required, the materials transported, all of it implies seaworthy craft, probably dugouts, lashed rafts, or perhaps even early hide-covered boats. Whatever their form, they were functional enough to carry people, animals, and supplies across significant stretches of open water. And they were not one-time trips. Some coastal sites show signs of regular movement, obsidian from Melos, for example, turning up in places that required multiple days of travel by sea. This suggests networks, not just settlement, but communication, perhaps exchange, perhaps shared ritual or kinship ties spread across watery landscapes. We often think of islands as isolated, but in the early Neolithic, they may have been bridges, connectors, gateways to new experiments in how humans could live. The picture becomes even more intriguing when we move farther west, into the Adriatic and eventually toward the western Mediterranean and the Atlantic fringes. While inland routes remained crucial, there is growing evidence that the sea remained an active highway. In some cases, the earliest farming communities in western regions appear along the coast before they appear inland. That reverses the standard model. It suggests people may have moved by sail, or at least by oar, rather than simply by walking. One of the places where this question becomes sharpest is the British Isles. By around 7,000 years before the Common Era, farming begins to appear in southern England and coastal Ireland. The traditional view was that it spread slowly north from the continent, but some of the dates and artifacts suggest a maritime component, that people may have arrived not through continental drift, but through sea crossings, from Brittany, from the Low Countries, from the Iberian Peninsula. This is still debated. But if true, it means that the Neolithic spread along the Atlantic coast was not just a marginal story, it was a primary route. What's also fascinating is how these coastal Neolithic communities often retain traces of their foraging pasts. Even as they planted crops and herded animals, they continued to gather shellfish, hunt marine mammals, and exploit tidal zones. In some places, these mixed economies lasted for centuries. It's as if the sea offered a buffer, a way to try farming without giving up everything else. Inland, the shift may have been starker. On the coast, it was more flexible, more reversible, and perhaps more sustainable. There's a deeper question here too. What does it mean that some of the earliest farmers were also sailors? It challenges our categories. We tend to think of seafaring as a later development, something that comes after cities, after metal tools, after states. But the evidence from the early Neolithic tells a different story. These were people with stone tools and woven baskets, but also with the ability to navigate the sea, to plan long-distance voyages, to sustain themselves in unfamiliar environments, and to replicate their way of life in places the land-bound couldn't easily reach. It suggests a kind of cognitive flexibility, a willingness to risk, to leave behind the known and test what might work elsewhere, not with certainty, not always with success, but with enough determination that farming, boats, and community spread together across vast distances. And still, it's easy to overlook. Inland archaeological sites are often better preserved, easier to excavate, more thoroughly studied. Coastal zones, by contrast, are vulnerable to erosion, to rising seas, to modern development. Many early Neolithic shorelines now lie underwater, submerged by millennia of sea level rise, which means we may be missing whole chapters, lost harbors, drowned farms, villages that once thrived where now only waves remain. Underneath this lies a quiet irony. Farming, which began as a land-based innovation, may have found some of its earliest momentum on water, and the people who spread it may not have marched steadily forward, but drifted with the currents, letting the coastline shape their future. We can't reconstruct all of it. The sea erases as much as it connects, but the fingerprints are there, in the shared seeds, the matching tools, the bones of animals that didn't swim to islands on their own. They point to a different kind of Neolithic story, one where people sailed toward new beginnings, not conquerors, not settlers, but experimenters, problem solvers, builders of homes in places where only wind and wave had lived before. And that brings us to one final curiosity. If the early Neolithic did ride the sea, how far did it go? Are there still places waiting to be rediscovered? Submerged settlements lying beneath the silt, holding clues to a time when farming floated across horizons? It is a reminder that even in the age of seeds and soil, the sea never stopped being part of the human imagination. That the first step toward a field might have begun not with a footfall, but with a paddle slicing silently through the water. What did we give up for a full stomach? At first glance, agriculture might look like the obvious improvement. More food, more people, more security. But bodies do not lie. And when we look closely at the skeletons of the first farmers, what we see is not the portrait of progress we might expect. We see shorter statures, weaker bones, more disease, and a growing list of internal trade-offs that quietly began to reshape the human experience. Beneath the surface of those steady harvests, the bodies of early agriculturalists began to tell a different story, one not of triumph, but of quiet degradation. Before farming, foragers across Anatolia, Greece, and the broader Near East lived highly mobile lives. Their diets were diverse, drawn from a wide spectrum of wild plants, hunted animals, fish, insects, and gathered roots. They moved often, carried few burdens, and rarely repeated the same movement every day. Their skeletons show strength and variety, broad joint surfaces, dense bone mass, and only occasional signs of malnutrition. But around 9,000 years before the Common Era, something began to change. Farming emerged. Diets narrowed. Labor routines stiffened into repetition, and the body began to break. One of the most consistent signals of this shift is height. Across multiple early Neolithic sites, from central Anatolia to Thessaly, adult statures decline markedly with the onset of agriculture. Men who once averaged over 170 centimeters began to drop below 160. Women show a similar trend. The causes are layered: reduced protein intake, higher carbohydrate dependence, periods of food stress, and crucially, a narrowing of dietary diversity. Early farmers often relied on cereals like wheat and barley, which, while calorically dense, lack several essential micronutrients unless processed carefully or paired with other foods. It turns out that a full belly is not the same as a nourished body. Another marker is enamel hypoplasia, defects in the development of tooth enamel caused by physiological stress during childhood. These lines and pits in the teeth record moments of hardship, malnutrition, or illness while the child was still growing. In many early Neolithic populations, the frequency of enamel hypoplasia increases. Children born into farming communities, despite having more access to food, were often under more physiological strain than their foraging ancestors. They were growing up in conditions where the diet was repetitive, the disease load higher, and the social pressures different. Then there is parodic hyperostosis and cribrorbitalia, sponge-like lesions that appear in the skull and eye sockets, often associated with chronic anemia. These conditions are more frequent in early farming populations than in their foraging predecessors. The causes are debated, but likely involve a combination of factors: iron-poor diets, increased intestinal parasites from close contact with domesticated animals, and frequent childhood infections. Living closer to one another, surrounded by waste, livestock, and limited sanitation, the first farmers created ideal conditions for disease transmission. Their children bore the brunt of it. Spinal degeneration is another common finding. Farming involves bending, lifting, grinding grain, hauling water, digging, all tasks that place strain on the lower back, hips, and knees. When people shifted from mobile foraging to sedentary agricultural life, their movement patterns changed. Repetition replaced variety, and the bones adapted in predictable but punishing ways. Vertebrae began to compress. Discs wore down. Some show signs of herniation or osteoarthritis even in young adults. Work, once woven through a varied and flexible schedule, had become grinding, literally. One of the clearest anatomical changes tied to this shift is the elbow. In many early agricultural communities, especially among women, the bones of the upper arms and forearms show signs of asymmetrical hypertrophy, one side bulked up more than the other. This is often linked to repetitive grain grinding with a saddle quern, a motion performed for hours each day. Over time, the skeleton absorbs that movement. The bones respond to stress by thickening, reshaping, remodeling themselves to endure the task. But that adaptation comes at a cost. Repetitive strain, joint pain, muscular imbalances. The body is trying to cope with a life it never evolved to perform. There are also signs of crowding-related disease. Foragers, moving in small bands, rarely sustained infections for long. Pathogens tend to burn out when the host population is small and dispersed. But once people began living together in larger groups, staying in one place, using the same water sources, and building up refuse, new problems emerged. Tuberculosis, typhoid, gastrointestinal parasites. None of these leave clear marks on every skeleton, but their fingerprints are there, in the stunted growth of children, in the inflamed joints of adults, in the increased rate of periosteal reactions, signs of infection on the outer surface of bones. And yet, even with all this data, we must tread carefully. These are statistical trends, not absolutes. Not every farmer suffered, not every forager thrived. There are outliers, variations, reversals. The archaeological record is partial, biased by preservation, excavation, and interpretation. But the pattern holds across enough sites to be meaningful. Something changed, and it was not entirely for the better. Why did people accept these costs? That is perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all. In the short term, agriculture could support more mouths. It allowed populations to grow. But growth is not health. It is survival, multiplied. More children lived long enough to reproduce, even if their lives were harder. The system worked, biologically speaking, by increasing quantity over quality. It didn't have to be pleasant, it just had to be effective. The change also wasn't necessarily conscious. No one sat down and decided to ruin their spine or shrink their children. These transitions happened slowly, over generations. What looked like abundance at first may have masked deeper declines. The loss of nutritional variety, the rise of endemic disease, the gradual erosion of bodily resilience in exchange for predictability. And that predictability may have been its own reward. With agriculture, people could stay put. They could plan, store, prepare. Even if the food was less nutritious, it was there. And in a world full of risks, predators, droughts, failed hunts, predictability can feel like peace, even if it's not. There's also a question of cultural momentum. Once a community becomes dependent on grains and sedentary life, reversing that path is difficult. Technologies evolve to support it. Social norms entrench it. Livelihoods adjust around it. People invest in fields, homes, and storage. Going back to foraging isn't just a dietary shift. It's an unmaking of identity. It's worth noting that some communities did resist. Not everyone rushed into farming. There were holdouts, hybrids, reversals. In some cases, foragers outlived their agricultural neighbors. But over time, the farming model spread, often not because it was better for the body, but because it allowed more bodies to exist. This is the paradox we're left with. Agriculture may have fed more people, but it also made many of them sicker. It supported larger communities, but those communities bore heavier physiological costs. The benefits were real: food surpluses, settled life, shared infrastructure, but so were the prices. And most of those prices were paid in bone. So what did we give up for a full stomach? Perhaps more than we realize. Height, resilience, mobility, health, in exchange for fertility, permanence, control. It is not a trade we can undo, but it is one we can try to understand. Because buried in the soil beneath those early villages are not just seeds of grain, but the traces of bodies stretched, strained, and reshaped by a choice no one fully understood at the time. And maybe that's the haunting question that lingers. If survival came at the cost of thriving, how many other trades have we made, silently, incrementally, that we've stopped noticing? When we chose abundance, what else did we leave behind? What if the first farms were warning signs, not blueprints? It is easy to look back at the Neolithic and see a straight line, from wild to domesticated, from temporary shelter to village, from scattered foragers to settled communities. But in truth, the path was never straight. It twisted, reversed, stumbled, and in more than one place, it failed. The story of early agriculture is not just a tale of triumph, but of fragility, of villages that rose and then emptied, of soil that stopped yielding, of plans that did not hold. Between 7,500 and 6,500 years before the Common Era, the heartlands of early agriculture began to show cracks, not in the sense of dramatic collapse, but in something subtler: slow abandonment, deserted houses, fields left fallow. In central Anatolia and parts of the Zagros Mountains, settlements that had been occupied for centuries began to shrink or vanish. Places like Çatalhöyük and Navali Chori were no longer thriving. What had once been centers of innovation and dense occupation began to fall silent. Some of the causes may lie in the land itself. Agriculture, especially early forms, was not easy on the environment. Continuous cropping, overgrazing, and the clearing of trees could rapidly exhaust local soils. Without knowledge of rotation or fallowing, nutrients were drawn down year after year. The result was declining yields. And in a world without long-distance supply chains, local decline meant real hardship. Some communities may have responded by moving, others by downsizing. But either way, the promise of stable food became more complicated than expected. Climate likely played a role too. The Neolithic was not a time of perfect stability. While generally warmer than the ice age that preceded it, this period included short-term shifts, cold snaps, droughts, sudden dry years. The so-called 8.2 kilo-year event stands out. Around 6,200 years before the Common Era, a rapid cooling episode triggered by the outflow of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic led to aridification in parts of the Near East. Some settlements appear to have been abandoned shortly afterward. But even outside that specific episode, local climate pressures could tip the balance in already stressed systems. Disease is harder to trace, but equally plausible. The close quarters of early villages, combined with animal domestication and poor sanitation, created new opportunities for pathogens. Many diseases leave little or no trace on bone, but their presence might be visible in broader patterns: demographic dips, child mortality spikes, sudden declines in site occupation. In some abandoned settlements, we find no dramatic evidence of violence or fire, just a quiet fade. Homes left to rot, hearths that were never rebuilt, as if people walked away not in panic but in weariness. It is also possible that cultural preferences shifted. Farming was never a singular package. It was an array of techniques, strategies, and experiments. Communities may have abandoned agriculture not because they failed, but because they chose something else. Hybrid models, more foraging, or entirely new configurations of land use. We must be careful not to assume that every empty house is a tragedy. Some might have been deliberate moves toward something better suited to local conditions. And then there is the human side. Early farming was hard. Grinding grain every day, hauling water, tending crops in heat and drought, dealing with blight or pests. If the rewards diminished and the work remained, dissatisfaction could build. If communities grew too fast, outpacing their food base, stress could mount. There is no reason to assume that early villagers lived in perfect harmony. Tensions over space, food, roles, and decisions could have pushed people apart. And when that happened, walking away might have been the simplest solution. At Neolithic sites across the region, we see hints of these dynamics. Layers of occupation interrupted by gaps, shifts in material culture suggesting a different population or purpose, burial traditions that disappear, change, or relocate, pottery styles that vanish without replacement. These are the archaeological signatures of discontinuity, of something unresolved. At Çatalhöyük, one of the largest and most studied Neolithic settlements in central Anatolia, there are signs of long-term occupation. But even here, the later levels show decline. The tightly packed housing loses its coherence. The elaborate wall paintings diminish. By the end of its use, the site had shrunk. People still lived there, but the energy had changed. It was no longer a beacon of Neolithic density. Something had shifted. This is not the story we usually tell. The grand arc of human history prefers steady progress. But real life does not follow a script. And the early Neolithic, far from being a golden age, may have been full of false starts. For every site that flourished, another failed. For every technique that spread, another vanished. Agriculture was not inevitable. It was risky, unstable, and deeply experimental. And yet through these failures, something persisted. The idea, perhaps more than the practice. The notion that food could be planted, controlled, secured. Even if one village fell apart, others learned, changed, adjusted. The broader trajectory continued not because it was easy or obvious, but because enough people kept trying. Still, we should not ignore the cost of those early experiments. Lives shortened, landscapes altered, knowledge lost and relearned. The first farms were not finished products. They were messy, uncertain, and sometimes unsustainable. In that sense, they were more warning than blueprint. A glimpse of what happens when we trade flexibility for permanence, mobility for rootedness, diversity for abundance. And perhaps that is the lesson, that progress is not linear, that some paths are dead ends, that human resilience lies not just in invention, but in adaptation, in knowing when to let go, to walk away, to try again. Because agriculture did not win by being perfect, it won by being persistent. So when we look at those empty villages, those abandoned hearths, those missing generations, we should not only ask why they failed, we should ask what they learned, what they left behind that others picked up, what fragments of choice still echo in our own uneasy balance between control and collapse. And we might wonder quietly, what if they saw the warning signs more clearly than we do now? Was the first great farming society too equal to survive? That's not a question anyone thought to ask until we started excavating hundreds of houses that all looked more or less the same. Long, wooden planked buildings stretching in neat rows across the prehistoric soil of Central Europe. There were no palaces, no temples, no monuments, and no obvious chiefs. Yet here, between 7,000 and 5,000 years before the Common Era, we find one of the largest, most coordinated farming expansions the world had ever seen. The linear band ceramic culture, or LBK for short, spread like a silent wave of wooden houses and cereal fields from the Danube to the Rhine, eventually reaching the North Sea. And for a time, it worked. The scale of the settlement system is impressive even by modern standards. Hundreds of kilometers covered in just a few centuries. Villages spaced at regular intervals, almost like planned outposts. Longhouses lined up with the grain of the land, each one seemingly built to the same basic blueprint. Roughly 20 to 40 meters long, divided into zones for sleeping, working, and storing, and each with its own plot of cultivated land, often barley or einkorn, lentils or peas. Livestock were present, especially cattle and pigs, but the real star of the show was the plow. For the first time in European prehistory, people weren't just planting seeds by hand. They were tilling the earth, breaking ground on a scale unimaginable just a few centuries earlier. And yet somehow, no one seemed to be in charge. That's what puzzled early archaeologists. Where were the central buildings, the elite graves, the ceremonial centers? They were looking for signs of hierarchy, and at first glance, the LBK seemed to offer none. No clear ruling class, no visible inequality, just rows and rows of similar homes. It was tempting to imagine this as a prehistoric utopia, a world of farmer families, all equal, all cooperating. A flat society in every sense. But archaeology rarely deals in ideals. As more sites were excavated, a more nuanced picture began to emerge. The uniformity might not have been equality, it might have been a system of tight norms, a cultural code that said everyone must conform, at least on the surface. And under that surface, the cracks began to show. Some longhouses were bigger than others. Some had more storage capacity, more animal bones, more grinding stones. A few even had infant burials beneath the floorboards, possibly an early sign of inherited status. And then there was the land. Recent landscape analysis suggests that while villages were evenly spaced, access to arable land may not have been. Some households likely had better plots, richer soils, or more secure claims. And that introduces the first hints of property, and the frictions it brings. Still, for a society that spread so far, so fast, without walled fortresses or warrior graves, something must have been working. One theory is that the LBK system functioned on kinship and cooperation, at least early on. Communities helped one another clear land, dig ditches, and raise timber-framed houses. There is even evidence of inter-village exchange of pottery styles and raw materials like obsidian and marine shells, which may have traveled hundreds of kilometers. But cooperation isn't the same as harmony. As the population grew and the best land filled up, competition increased. There are subtle signs of stress in the archaeological record. Palisades appear around some villages, the first defensive structures. Mass graves emerge, including one at Talheim in present-day Germany, where over 30 individuals were found with signs of blunt force trauma, skulls cracked and bones broken, seemingly killed in a single violent event. The utopia, if it ever existed, was fraying. Yet it's important to be careful here. Violence does not mean failure. All societies contain conflict. What matters is how they manage it. The LBK model may have lacked chiefs and kings, but that doesn't mean it lacked systems. Some archaeologists believe there were shared ritual practices, possibly seasonal gatherings at central places now lost beneath later layers. Others point to long-distance trade routes as signs of economic coordination. But what is striking is just how few symbolic objects have survived. There is little monumental art, few figurines, no temples, and only rare signs of social differentiation in burials. If there were leaders, they left little trace. If there were spiritual beliefs, they were expressed in perishable forms. And if there were tensions, they seem to have been absorbed quietly until they could not be. Around 5,500 years before the Common Era, signs of LBK cohesion begin to decline. Some villages were abandoned, others were burned, not necessarily by invaders, but sometimes from within. There are signs of rebuilding, reorganization, and eventually, replacement. The uniform longhouse model fades. New cultures rise with new ceramics, new burial customs, and new ways of organizing land and labor. But what lingers is the idea that the LBK world was a kind of first draft, a grand experiment in large-scale sedentary life across temperate Europe. It showed what was possible: food surpluses, fixed homes, intergenerational farming. But it also showed the fragility of balance, how fast a flat system can become uneven, how quickly shared norms can harden into quiet inequalities. And maybe that's the real question, not why the LBK ended, but how it lasted so long without visible hierarchy. Did shared architecture really mean shared power? Or were people simply hiding tensions beneath the surface, managing them through unspoken rules, marriage ties, or quiet exclusion? Could it be that early farmers preferred a system where power was distributed not by throne or sword, but by access to tools, networks, and land? Or perhaps the pressure to conform kept everyone in check, until one day it didn't. We often look back on farming societies as progress, as a step toward civilization. But the LBK reminds us that early agriculture wasn't a straight path. It was a delicate balance between freedom and conformity, growth and strain, abundance and fracture. And maybe the neat rows of longhouses weren't a symbol of equality after all, but a quiet warning about how hard it is to build something that works for everyone, and how quickly that balance can tip. So we return to the question: was the first great farming society too equal to survive? Or did it fail because, beneath the surface, it wasn't equal at all? Either way, the LBK left its mark, not in temples or kings, but in a quiet blueprint of a system that tried, for a little while, to hold everything together with nothing more than food, wood, and hope. Did farming create peace, or just give us new things to fight over? For a long time, the spread of early agriculture in Europe was seen as a story of quiet transformation. Fields where forests once stood, rows of houses where nomads once wandered, a shift from uncertainty to stability, from risk to routine. But the archaeological record suggests that something else was simmering beneath the surface. Starting around 5,500 years before the Common Era, signs of rising tension begin to appear across Central Europe. And by 4,000 years before the Common Era, much of the once cohesive world of the LBK had fractured, not with a bang, but with blood, fire, and silence. At first, it was hard to believe. The linear band ceramic culture, or LBK, had built one of the most expansive farming systems ever attempted by early humans. Villages stretched from the Danube to the Rhine, composed of orderly longhouses arranged like ribs on a vast skeleton of settlement. For generations, these communities thrived, growing grain, raising animals, and digging ditches to mark their spaces. But then came the signs of rupture. Across dozens of sites, archaeologists began to uncover longhouses that had been deliberately burned. And not just collapsed by accident or eroded by time, these structures were often charred from within, roof beams scorched, clay walls warped by intense heat. In many cases, there was no attempt to rebuild. The sites were abandoned. Or worse. Alongside the burn layers came something even harder to explain. Bodies. Mass graves, sometimes shallow, sometimes carefully arranged, began to emerge beneath the soil. At Talheim in southern Germany, the remains of 34 individuals were found in a single pit, men, women, and children. Many showed signs of cranial trauma, their skulls caved in by blunt instruments. There were no accompanying grave goods, no signs of a ceremonial burial. At Schletz in Austria, a similar story unfolded. Scores of skeletons, many with broken limbs and crushed skulls, some scattered along what appeared to be the defensive ditch of the settlement itself. These were not peaceful deaths, and they were not isolated. Across the LBK world, from Alsace to Slovakia, the late phase of settlement is increasingly marked by what can only be described as organized violence. Not battlefield encounters in the modern sense, but targeted, repeated episodes of community destruction. The motives remain elusive. Were these raids between rival villages, acts of revenge, resource conflicts, or something else entirely, something ritualized, a way of ending or cleansing a site before abandonment? In some cases, the attackers seem to have been from nearby communities. The victims often shared the same material culture, the same pottery styles, even the same genetic profiles. This was not invasion by a foreign group. It was violence from within. And that raises troubling questions about what farming may have changed, not just on the land, but in the human mind. With sedentism came accumulation, crops, tools, food stores, things that could be hoarded, guarded, stolen. And with land boundaries came disputes. Whose field was whose? Who had the better soil, the deeper well, the safer fence? These are not problems hunter-gatherers faced in quite the same way. Their mobility allowed for dispersal in times of tension. Farmers, locked into place by their fields and houses, had fewer options. Some researchers point to social stress as a key factor. As populations grew and land filled up, younger generations may have struggled to find space to establish their own farms. This land squeeze could lead to internal tensions, especially in a system that, for centuries, had emphasized conformity and shared norms. If every house looked the same and every family was supposed to follow the same script, what happened when that script no longer worked? When resources ran short or rules were bent? Others have proposed a darker possibility, that some of the violence was ritualized. The deliberate burning of houses, sometimes with symbolic objects inside, might have served as a kind of social reset, a way to close down a lineage or mark a shift in power. In a world without writing, architecture and fire may have spoken in ways we no longer understand. The house itself, with its wooden beams and packed clay floors, could have been more than just shelter. It might have embodied ancestry, memory, obligation. To destroy it could have been an act of severing ties or a violent renewal. But we don't know for sure. The bones do not speak in words, only in wounds, and the patterns of trauma, especially the repeated blows to the skull, suggest something more intimate than war. These were not mass killings from a distance. They were personal, up close, deliberate, often inflicted with clubs or stone axes. Some victims appear to have been pursued, caught, and executed. Others may have been surprised in their sleep, and still others, possibly, taken as captives. There are signs at some sites of selective burial where young adult males are underrepresented. Were they taken? Were they the attackers? The lack of written records leaves us guessing. But genetics offers another layer of complexity. Ancient DNA from LBK burials reveals that while these communities shared ancestry, they were not homogeneous. Local foragers had mixed with incoming farmers over time, creating new populations with hybrid lineages. This blending, while biologically rich, may have created new social dynamics. Perhaps identity became more contested. Perhaps boundaries hardened. Perhaps shared culture wasn't enough to prevent conflict once the system came under stress. And then, over the course of several centuries, the system dissolved. By 4,000 years before the Common Era, the signature longhouses of the LBK had all but disappeared from the archaeological record. The uniform villages were gone. In their place arose a patchwork of smaller, more varied cultures, each with its own settlement style, pottery, and way of life. Some returned to mobility, others experimented with new forms of community. But the great house rows, the careful village grids, the synchronized expansion, they were done. Was it collapse or adaptation? Some researchers resist the language of failure. After all, people did not vanish. They changed. They moved. They mixed. But the end of the LBK marks the end of a particular vision, a world where hundreds of farming villages could operate with minimal hierarchy, minimal symbolism, and apparent cohesion for centuries. Whatever held it together, be it kinship, cooperation, or simple necessity, eventually unraveled. And what replaced it was not a new order, but many small ones. So we return to the question, did farming create peace, or just new ways to go to war? Perhaps both. Perhaps peace and violence are not opposites, but alternating phases of the same experiment. The first farmers in Europe tried something enormous. They changed the land, reshaped their bodies, transformed their diets, and built a system that, for a while, allowed millions to live in permanent settlements without kings or armies. But no system is immune to pressure, and once the pressure came, whether from within or without, the cracks widened. The burned houses and broken skulls remind us that early agriculture was not just a revolution in food. It was a revolution in meaning, in belonging, in risk. It created new things to protect and new reasons to attack. And while we often think of the Neolithic as the birth of civilization, it may be more accurate to see it as the birth of complexity, of contradiction, of systems that can nourish and fracture in the same breath. In the ashes of the LBK, we are left with a final unsettling question. If one of the most coordinated farming societies in prehistory couldn't hold together without eventually breaking, what makes us think ours will? If we could go back to that quiet moment when a seed first slipped into soil on purpose, would we do it again? It is tempting, from the vantage point of tens of thousands of years later, to imagine that agriculture was a decision, that someone, somewhere, chose this path with clear eyes and full awareness. But the truth, so far as we can piece it together, is far murkier. Farming was not a single event. It was a slow entanglement, a creeping spiral, and once the first turn began, it may have been impossible to stop. Between 20,000 and 4,000 years before the Common Era, across nearly every continent, human lifeways began to change. Some faster, some slower, some not at all. But the shift was never total and never clean. And it may be that the most important thing about the so-called Neolithic revolution is that it was never really a revolution at all. For decades, the standard story painted farming as a breakthrough, a moment of genius. Humans discovered how to control plants and animals, and from there came surplus, settlement, civilization. But the archaeological record refuses to fit that neat arc. We now know that humans had been modifying their environments long before domestication, burning forests, redirecting water, shaping landscapes to encourage edible plants. These were not passive foragers, they were active ecologists. And the transition to full-scale agriculture was not a straight line, but a mosaic of trial and error. In some places, people flirted with farming for centuries without ever fully committing. In others, they adopted grains but not animals, or settled in villages without growing food, or planted crops and then left them behind. This messiness matters, because it tells us something crucial. Farming was not inevitable. It was not destiny. It was a complex response to local conditions, cultural choices, and feedback loops that often escaped control. In the Levant, people gathered wild cereals for millennia before domesticating them. In the Zagros Mountains, goats began to change under human pressure long before they were truly tamed. In China, rice cultivation emerged in slow pulses, not leaps. And in the Americas, plants like squash, beans, and maize followed entirely different rhythms. Everywhere we look, the origin of farming is less a story of invention and more a story of entanglement. A web tightening slowly until escape was no longer possible. Why then did it happen? One answer is resilience. As climates warmed after the last ice age, environments changed. Resources shifted. Populations grew. In some areas, reliable foraging became harder, and cultivation may have seemed like a buffer, a way to hedge against lean seasons. But farming brought new demands: labor, planning, storage, and once those systems were in place, they changed the rules. People had to stay put, had to defend their fields, had to invest in tools and infrastructure, and that meant more food was needed to support the growing effort, which meant more fields, more mouths, more time in the loop. Another answer is social. Farming didn't just produce calories, it produced rhythms, seasons to track, cycles to follow, shared labor to organize. And with that came ceremony, myth, memory. The planting of seeds may have gone hand in hand with the planting of meaning. Communities rooted in place began to build stories about that place, its spirits, its ancestors, its obligations. The field was no longer just a source of food, it was a stage for identity, and that made it harder to walk away. But perhaps the most haunting answer is ecological. Agriculture is not just a human strategy, it is a co-evolutionary process. The plants we grew changed us as we changed them. Wheat, barley, rice, millet. They adapted to our hands, our timing, our fires. And in turn, our bodies changed. Our teeth, our bones, our digestion, even our genes. We became dependent not just on the food, but on the entire system, on the cycles of sowing and reaping, on the storage pits and granaries, on the labor structures and land tenure. We didn't just farm, we became farmed, by the landscape, by the logic of growth, by the demands of the loop itself. And yet it didn't happen everywhere. That too must be remembered. Many human societies resisted or reworked agriculture for thousands of years. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, foraging remained dominant even as nearby regions adopted millet and yams. In Australia, indigenous groups developed complex land management without ever planting seeds. In the Pacific Northwest of North America, fishing economies supported dense populations without farming. These were not failed farmers. They were successful humans. They had other loops, other systems, other choices. But over time, the farming loop spread. Not always by conquest, often by mingling, by marriage, trade, imitation, migration, and sometimes simply by proximity. Farmers could support more people, more children. That mattered. Over generations, their descendants came to dominate the demographic landscape. And so the loop closed, not by intention, but by drift, by fertility, by inertia. What was lost in that drift? We will never fully know. Some argue that farming gave us art, cities, writing, that without it, we would never have reached the stars. But others note that the first villages brought new burdens. Workloads rose, health declined, diet narrowed, social tensions increased. The graves of the Neolithic are full of bones worn down by strain, children dead from anemia, mothers lost in childbirth. Was this progress, or was it just momentum? Even today, the earliest farmers can feel oddly distant. We know them through their bones, their pottery, their pollen records. But we do not know what they thought of their new lives. Did they feel pride in their harvests, or regret for their aching backs? Did they dream of the forests they no longer walked? Or did they build new dreams, rooted in soil and song and memory? We cannot ask them. All we have are the traces. And yet in those traces, there is a warning, not a prophecy, not a judgment, but a pattern. Once a society commits to agriculture, it must grow to survive. Surplus becomes expectation. Stored food becomes political leverage. Fields become fences. The loop rewards expansion, even when expansion strains the system. And when it breaks, it doesn't break evenly. Some benefit, others bear the cost. This is not new. It has been with us since the beginning. Still, we should resist the urge to paint farming as a mistake. That too is a kind of myth, a clean label where complexity belongs. The truth is that early agriculture was neither triumph nor tragedy. It was a tangled choice, made over and over in different places for different reasons. It solved some problems and created others. It offered stability and extracted health. It built homes and tore up forests. It allowed for beauty, ritual, culture, and also for boundaries, scarcity, and death. So we return to the question, if we could undo the first seed, would we? The honest answer is, we don't know. Because we are still inside the loop, still tracing its turns, still feeding its spiral. And from here, the beginning is hard to see. The people who lived between 20,000 and 4,000 years before the Common Era were not us. But they were not aliens either. They were humans trying to survive, to belong, to imagine a future, just as we are. Their choices became our world, and their loops became our cage, or our cradle. Perhaps it depends on what we choose to grow next. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for following the roots of this story, for walking through the dust of old villages, the silence of abandoned fields, and the footprints left by the first hands to plant a seed. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you focus, or just helped you breathe a little deeper in a noisy world, I'm grateful you're here. If you think others should hear the long, strange tale of how we became farmers and what we may have lost along the way, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life. And tell me, are you listening by firelight, by lamplight, somewhere in the fields, the cities, or the in-between? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.